Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It sounded like water hitting metal. Just a gentle plink, inconsistent yet persistent, echoing through the stillness of the room. I stood in the entryway, a photo frame trembling slightly in my grip. The walls ached with quiet, unmarred by any other sound but that single repetitive drop. It shouldn't have been possible, not in this house where the pipes ran differently, where faucets were nowhere near. Each drip seemed to ripple outward, brushing against the edges of a distant, unclear memory. A place I shouldn't remember, yet it tugged at my thoughts like a current pulling at loose threads. The air felt thicker with each plink, as if an unsolved question lingered right behind the sound. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for something to follow. I hadn't heard that drip since the night the storm flooded everything, and now it was here. The photo frame in my hands felt heavier than it should. The glass was cracked in a spider web pattern, splitting the faces inside into fragments. A family gathering, all smiles and raised glasses, but the crack ran directly through one face, making it impossible to tell who had been standing there. I couldn't remember breaking it, yet here it was, damaged and somehow wrong in my grip. I set it down on the hall table, next to a set of keys that didn't belong to me. They were old-fashioned, brass with intricate teeth, the kind that opened heavy doors in houses built when locks meant something different. The metal was warm, as if someone had been holding them just before I arrived. The dripping continued, drawing me deeper into the house. Each step on the hardwood floor seemed to echo the rhythm, my footfalls matching the water's percussion. The smell hit me as I moved through the living room, something metallic and damp, mixed with the faint sweetness of flowers left too long in stagnant water. It reminded me of the basement after heavy rains, that musty scent of things slowly drowning. In the kitchen I found the source, or what should have been the source. The sink was bone dry, its chrome surface reflecting the overhead light in harsh angles. But the sound persisted, coming from somewhere behind the walls, inside them, as if the house itself was weeping. I pressed my ear to the plaster, feeling the cool surface against my cheek. The dripping seemed to move, shifting from one wall to another, always just out of reach. The refrigerator hummed to life, its motor breaking the spell. I stepped back, noticing for the first time that the kitchen table was set for two. Clean plates, folded napkins, silverware aligned with military precision. A bottle of wine stood open, its contents dark and still. Two glasses waited, one with a faint lipstick stain on the rim, the other untouched. I didn't remember setting the table. I lived alone, had for months since the investigation closed. The detective had been clear about that, no evidence of foul play, case dismissed, life moves on. But the table suggested otherwise, implied a dinner that never happened or one I couldn't recall. The wine bottle bore no label, its dark glass revealing nothing about its contents. When I lifted it, the liquid moved sluggishly, too thick for wine, too dark for anything I recognized. I set it down quickly, my fingers coming away slightly sticky. The smell that rose from the bottle's mouth was wrong, not spoiled exactly, but altered, as if something had been added that didn't belong. The dripping grew louder, more insistent. I followed the sound up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The banister felt gritty beneath my palm, coated with a fine dust that shouldn't have accumulated so quickly. The house had been cleaned thoroughly after the incident, scrubbed by professionals who specialized in making problems disappear. At the top of the stairs, I paused. 3 doors faced me, all slightly ajar, revealing slivers of darkness beyond. The dripping seemed to come from all of them simultaneously, a chorus of water finding metal in impossible places. I chose the middle door, pushing it open with fingertips that suddenly felt numb. The room was empty except for a single chair positioned in the center, facing away from the door. It was the same chair that had been in the basement, the one the investigators had photographed from every angle. High-backed, wooden with rope burns on the arms where something had been tied too tightly. They'd taken it as evidence, tagged and catalogued, yet here it sat as if it had never left. I walked around to face the chair, my footsteps muffled by carpet that felt damp beneath my shoes. The seat cushion bore an impression, as if someone had been sitting there recently, the fabric still compressed in the shape of a human form. But the house had been empty when I arrived. I was certain of that, wasn't I? The dripping stopped. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the sound had been. It pressed against my eardrums, making me aware of my own heartbeat, my shallow breathing, the rustle of my clothes as I shifted weight from one foot to the other. I strained to hear something, anything, but the house had swallowed all sound except for my own presence within it. A photograph lay on the floor beside the chair, face down. I picked it up with trembling fingers, already knowing what I would find but hoping I was wrong. The image was water damaged, the colors bleeding into each other like watercolors in rain. But the faces were still recognizable, the same family from the cracked frame downstairs, the same gathering, the same raised glasses. Except in this version, the missing face was clear, unmarked by any crack. It was mine. I was standing among them, glass raised in celebration, smiling at something just outside the frame. But I had no memory of the occasion, no recollection of being part of their family, their joy, their final toast. The photo felt cold in my hands, its edges soft from water damage that seemed fresh despite the image's obvious age. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I spun around, but the doorway remained empty, the hallway beyond dark and still. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. The house was playing tricks, I told myself. Old buildings settled, made sounds, created impressions of presence where none existed. But the chair was facing a different direction now. I was certain it had been turned away from the door when I entered, yet now it faced me directly, as if whoever had been sitting there had swiveled to watch my discovery of the photograph. The seat cushion still bore its impression, but the shape seemed different now, smaller, as if the occupant had been a child rather than an adult. The dripping resumed, but from a new location. This time it seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if water was running down inside them, finding its way through hidden channels to some unseen metal surface below. I pressed my palms against the wallpaper, feeling for dampness, but the surface was dry, almost dusty. In the next room, I found more evidence of lives I couldn't remember living. A dresser with its drawers pulled open, clothes spilling out as if someone had packed in haste. The garments were familiar, a sweater I recognized, shoes I remembered buying, a watch that had belonged to my father. But they were arranged wrong, folded differently than I would have done, suggesting hands other than mine had handled them. The mirror above the dresser was fogged, as if someone had just taken a hot shower, but the bathroom was at the other end of the hall. I wiped the condensation away with my sleeve, revealing my reflection in fragments as the moisture cleared. For a moment I looked different, older, more worn, with eyes that held knowledge I didn't remember acquiring. A hairbrush sat on the dresser's surface, tangled with long strands that weren't mine. The hair was darker, coarser, belonging to someone who had been here recently enough to leave such intimate traces. I lifted the brush, studying the strands in the light from the window. They seemed to move slightly, as if stirred by a breeze that didn't exist. The window itself was open, just a crack, enough to let in the sound of wind through trees and the distant hum of traffic. But when I looked outside, the view was wrong. The street was different, lined with houses I didn't recognize, populated by shadows that moved with purpose I couldn't understand. A figure stood under the streetlight across the way, too far to make out clearly but close enough to suggest they were watching the house, waiting for something to happen. I closed the window, but the latch wouldn't catch properly. It kept sliding open, as if the house wanted to maintain that connection to the outside world, that escape route or entry point. The glass was cold against my palm, colder than the night air warranted, and when I pulled my hand away, it left a print that faded slowly, reluctantly. The third room held the greatest surprise. It was set up as an office, complete with a desk, filing cabinets, and a computer that hummed quietly in standby mode. Papers were scattered across the desk's surface, covered in handwriting I recognized as my own but couldn't remember producing. Notes about times and places, names without faces, questions without answers. One sheet caught my attention. It was a timeline meticulously detailed, chronicling events I had no memory of witnessing. Meetings in parking lots, conversations overheard through thin walls, payments made in cash to people whose names were abbreviated to single letters. At the bottom of the page, in my own handwriting, was a single word: evidence. The filing cabinets were locked, but the keys from the hall table fit perfectly. Inside, I found folders organized by date, each containing photographs, documents, and recordings. The photos showed people in compromising situations, engaging in activities they wouldn't want made public. The documents detailed financial transactions, property transfers, and agreements that seemed designed to hide rather than clarify. But it was the recordings that disturbed me most. Hours of conversations, captured on devices I didn't remember placing, featuring voices I recognized but couldn't quite place. My own voice appeared frequently, asking questions, making arrangements, promising things I hoped I hadn't delivered. The quality was poor, as if the recordings had been made in secret, through walls or from hiding places. One conversation stood out, two voices, one male, one female, discussing a problem that needed to be solved permanently. They spoke in code, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had become a liability, knew too much, posed a threat that couldn't be ignored. The solution they discussed was final, irreversible, and I was apparently the one they expected to implement it. The female voice was familiar in a way that made my chest tight. I played the recording again, focusing on her inflection, her choice of words, the way she paused before saying anything important. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise through fog, bringing with it a nausea that had nothing to do with the musty air. It was my voice. I was both participants in the conversation, speaking to myself in different tones, different accents, as if I were two people sharing the same body. The male voice was deeper, more confident, making decisions and giving orders. The female voice was hesitant, asking questions, seeking reassurance for actions that seemed to terrify her. The timestamp on the recording placed the conversation just before the storm, the night everything flooded, the night the investigation began. I listened to myself plan something I couldn't remember executing, heard my own voice describe methods and locations with a familiarity that suggested experience. The dripping returned, louder now, more urgent. It seemed to be coming from directly overhead, as if water was pooling in the attic and finding its way through the ceiling. But when I looked up, the surface was unmarked, free of the stains that water damage always left behind. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, guided by the sound and a growing certainty that I would find answers there, whether I wanted them or not. The space was cramped, forcing me to duck beneath sloping beams and navigate around obstacles I couldn't see clearly in the dim light filtering through a single small window. The dripping was definitely coming from here, but not from any visible source. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house was bleeding water from wounds I couldn't locate. I followed the noise to the far corner, where a collection of boxes sat stacked against the eaves. The boxes were labeled in my handwriting, dated and organized with a precision that suggested they contained something important. Personal effects, read one. Financial records, said another. But it was the third box that made my hands shake as I opened it. Insurance. Inside were documents I didn't remember signing, policies I didn't remember purchasing, beneficiaries I didn't remember naming. Life insurance, disability coverage, accidental death benefits, all with substantial payouts, all purchased in the months leading up to the storm. The paperwork was thorough, professional, the kind of preparation someone made when they expected the unexpected. But the most disturbing discovery was at the bottom of the box, a death certificate, official and stamped, bearing a name I recognized but couldn't quite place. The cause of death was listed as drowning, the location as a basement during a flood, the date as the night of the storm. The signature at the bottom was mine, but I wasn't qualified to sign death certificates, wasn't authorized to make such official determinations. The dripping stopped again, but this time the silence felt different. Not empty, but full of waiting, as if the house was holding its breath while I processed what I'd found. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, charged with the weight of secrets that were finally surfacing. I heard footsteps on the stairs below, slow and deliberate, climbing toward the attic. But I was alone in the house, had been since I arrived. The footsteps paused at the attic door, and I could feel someone listening, just as I was listening, both of us aware of the other's presence, but neither willing to acknowledge it directly. The door creaked open, and a voice called up my voice, but different somehow, older, more tired. It asked if I'd found what I was looking for, if I was ready to remember what I'd worked so hard to forget. The tone was patient, understanding, as if the speaker knew exactly what I was going through because they'd been through it themselves. I didn't answer, I couldn't. The truth was spreading through my consciousness like water through fabric, soaking into every corner of my awareness until there was nowhere left for denial to hide. The investigation that had been closed, the case that had been dismissed, the life I thought I was living alone, all of it was built on foundations that were shifting beneath me. The footsteps resumed, climbing the attic stairs now, each step bringing the other version of myself closer to a confrontation I wasn't sure I could survive. But when the figure appeared at the top of the stairs, it wasn't another version of me at all. It was the person from the death certificate, the one who had supposedly drowned in the basement during the storm. They were dry now, clean, showing no signs of having spent time underwater. They looked exactly as they had in life, except for their eyes, which held the kind of knowledge that only comes from crossing boundaries that aren't meant to be crossed. They sat down in the chair I now realized had been waiting for them, the same chair from the bedroom below, somehow transported to the attic without my noticing. The rope burns on the arms made sense now, not from being tied up, but from holding on, from trying to stay connected to something solid while everything else dissolved around them. The dripping resumed, but now I could see its source. Water was seeping through the walls, not from broken pipes or roof leaks, but from memories that were finally surfacing, experiences that had been buried so deep they'd found their own way to the surface. Each drop carried with it a fragment of truth, a piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve without realizing I was both the detective and the perpetrator. They spoke without moving their lips, their voice coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the attic with explanations I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. They told me about the night of the storm, about the basement that flooded, about the choice I'd made when the water started rising. They described the moment when survival became more important than morality, when saving myself meant sacrificing someone else. But their version of events didn't match the official record, didn't align with the investigation's findings, didn't correspond to the memories I thought I'd preserved. According to them, the basement hadn't flooded naturally. The water had been directed there, channeled through modifications I'd made to the drainage system, pooled in a space where someone was waiting, someone who trusted me enough to follow me into a trap. The insurance money had been the motive, they explained, but not the only one. There had been other consideration secrets that needed to stay buried, evidence that needed to disappear, a future that required a different past than the one I'd actually lived. The storm had provided the perfect cover, the ideal explanation for an accident that wasn't accidental at all. I wanted to deny it, to argue that they were wrong, that I wasn't capable of such calculation, such betrayal. But the evidence surrounded me, the recordings, the photographs, the meticulous planning that had gone into creating a crime that looked like a natural disaster. My own voice on the tapes, my own handwriting in the files, my own signature on documents that proved premeditation. The dripping grew faster, more insistent, as if the house was running out of time to tell its story. Water began to pool on the attic floor, rising slowly but steadily, recreating the conditions that had existed in the basement that night. I could smell it now, not clean water, but the murky, contaminated flood that had covered everything, washing away evidence and creating new truths to replace the ones that had been destroyed. They stood up from the chair, extending a hand toward me, inviting me to remember completely, to stop fighting the current and let myself be carried back to that night when everything changed. Their touch was cold, wet, carrying with it the sensation of drowning, of water filling lungs that weren't designed to process liquid, of consciousness fading while someone watched from safety. But as their fingers touched mine, I realized something that changed everything again. The hand was warm, dry, very much alive. The person standing before me wasn't a ghost or a memory or a manifestation of guilt. They were real, present, breathing the same stale attic air I was breathing. Which meant the death certificate was fake. The drowning was staged. The investigation had been closed not because there was no evidence of foul play, but because the victim had never actually died. The elaborate insurance fraud, the careful planning, the recordings of conversations that sounded like murder plots, all of it had been designed to create a crime that never happened, to collect money for a death that was entirely fictional. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it lasted only a moment before new questions crowded in. If they were alive, where had they been all this time? Why had they allowed me to believe I was a murderer? What was the purpose of the elaborate deception, and what did they want from me now? They smiled, reading the confusion in my expression, and began to explain. The plan had been mutual, they said, a way for both of us to escape situations that had become impossible. I'd needed the insurance money to pay debts that would have destroyed me. They'd needed to disappear from a life that had become dangerous, to become someone else entirely. The basement flooding had been real, but carefully controlled. They'd hidden in the space I'd prepared, breathing through a tube connected to the surface, while I'd called for help and played the role of the devastated survivor. The body the investigators found had been procured from other sources, damaged enough by water to make identification difficult, but positive enough to close the case. We'd both gotten what we wanted. I'd gotten the money, they'd gotten their new identity. But the plan had required us to stay apart, to never contact each other, to live as if the other person had truly died. For months it had worked perfectly, until tonight, when the sound of dripping water had brought back memories I'd thought were buried forever. But something had gone wrong with their new life, they explained. The identity they'd assumed had complications they hadn't anticipated. People were asking questions, making connections, threatening to expose the entire scheme. They needed to disappear again, but this time they needed my help to do it properly. The water in the attic was rising faster now, covering my shoes, soaking through my clothes, recreating the panic of that night in the basement. But this time I understood that the danger was real, not staged. If we were discovered, if the truth came out, both of us would face charges that would destroy any chance of a normal life. They outlined their new plan as the water reached my knees. Another death, another disappearance, another chance to start over. But this time I would be the one who vanished, leaving behind a body that would satisfy investigators while I took on the identity they'd been using. It was elegant, symmetrical, a perfect reversal of our original scheme. The only problem was that I no longer wanted to disappear. The months of living with guilt had changed me, made me value the simple fact of existing under my own name, in my own life, however complicated it had become. The insurance money was gone, spent on debts and lawyers, and the kind of therapy that couldn't actually address the real source of my problems. But I'd found something resembling peace in the ruins of my conscience. I told them no and watched their expression change from persuasion to disappointment to something harder, more determined. The water was at my waist now, and I realized that the rising level wasn't accidental. They'd modified the attic just as I'd modified the basement, creating a space where water could be controlled, directed, used as a weapon that would leave no traces of violence. The chair they'd been sitting in was now floating, bumping against the sloping ceiling, its rope-burned arms reaching toward me like an accusation. I could hear the dripping again, but now I understood it wasn't water hitting metal, it was the sound of time running out, opportunities closing, chances disappearing beneath the surface of choices that couldn't be unmade. They moved toward the stairs, toward higher ground, toward safety, just as I had done that night in the basement. But this time I was the one left behind, the one who'd trusted too much, the one who'd followed someone into a trap designed to solve problems I'd helped create. The water reached my chest, cold and murky, carrying with it the smell of secrets that had been buried too long. I could feel my feet losing contact with the floor, my body beginning to float in the confined space, my head approaching the ceiling that would soon become my sky. But as the water rose around me, I realized something that changed everything one final time. The attic had no windows that could be opened from outside. The door at the bottom of the stairs was the only way in or out, and I had the keys, the brass keys from the hall table, the ones that opened old-fashioned locks in houses where security meant something different. They were trapped up here with me, subject to the same rising water, the same approaching ceiling, the same narrowing space between breath and drowning. Their plan had been as flawed as mine had been, as desperate, as likely to destroy the planner as the target. We looked at each other across the shrinking pocket of air, both of us understanding that we'd created a situation neither of us could control. The water continued to rise, indifferent to our intentions, our regrets, our sudden desire to undo what we'd set in motion. The dripping had stopped, replaced by the steady gurgle of water finding its level, filling every available space, erasing the distinctions between victim and perpetrator, between guilt and innocence, between the living and the dead. In the end, the house would hold our secrets as it had always held them, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the next storm to bring them back to light. I closed my eyes and listened to the water, letting it carry me toward whatever truth was waiting on the other side of breath. The photo frame downstairs would remain cracked, the faces inside forever fragmented, the family gathering frozen in a moment of celebration that had led to this moment of reckoning. The sound of water hitting metal had been a warning, I realized now. Not of danger approaching, but of danger that had never left, that had been circling back toward its source, toward the moment when all the careful planning would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Somewhere in the rising water, I could hear the echo of that original drip, patient and persistent, marking time until the truth could finally surface. Story 2. The scent of fresh pine wafted through the open living room window, mingling with the faint aroma of stale cigarettes. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting gentle patterns on the hardwood floor. The house was an epitome of calm, yet the sheer stillness felt intrusive, like a misplaced whisper at a silent gathering. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily, its hand frozen at a peculiar minute. Everything felt untouched except for the window that shouldn't have been open at all. I keep coming back to that window, the way it gaped open like a mouth trying to speak, or maybe trying to breathe. I can't remember if I opened it or if it was already like that when I walked in. The memory shifts every time I reach for it, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. There was someone else in the house that morning, I'm almost certain of it. The cigarette smell wasn't mine. I'd stopped years before, after the doctor said my lungs looked like charcoal sketches, but whose cigarettes, the scent clung to the air with the persistence of guilt, mixing with that pine smell that seemed too clean, too deliberate. The grandfather clock, its face stared at me with brass accusation. The minute hand pointed somewhere between numbers, frozen in a moment I can't quite place. Had it always been broken? I remember winding it once, the key heavy in my palm, the mechanism grinding like old bones. But when was that, before or after? My sister used to smoke those thin cigarettes, the ones that left lipstick stains on the filters. She'd stand by windows when she visited, blowing smoke into the outside air like she was trying to send signals. But she hadn't visited in so long, had she? I'm standing in the living room again, and the patterns of light have shifted. Or maybe I've been standing here longer than I thought. The hardwood creaks under my feet, and I realize I'm moving toward the window without deciding to. My hand reaches for the frame, and there's something sticky on the wood. Sap maybe, or something else. The house feels different now, smaller, like the walls have been listening to my thoughts and drawing closer. I turn around, and there's an ashtray on the coffee table that wasn't there before. Or was it 3 cigarette butts, lipstick stained, arranged in a triangle? My sister's shade, cherry something, cherry bomb, cherry kiss. I remember a conversation now, fragments of it, her voice sharp like broken glass, you never listen, and my voice defensive, I'm listening now. But what was she trying to tell me? The words float just beyond my reach, like objects at the bottom of dark water. The pine smell is stronger near the window. I lean out and see the tree in the yard, its branches close enough to touch the glass. Some of the needles have fallen onto the windowsill, brown and brittle. How long have they been there? Long enough to dry out, to lose their color. Long enough to become evidence of something I can't name. There's a photograph on the mantel that keeps catching my eye. The frame is turned slightly away, like someone adjusted it and forgot to straighten it. In the picture, 2 people stand beside a car. One of them might be me, but younger. The other person's face is obscured by shadow or maybe by time itself. I want to walk over and look closer, but my feet feel rooted to this spot by the window. The cigarette smell is fading now, or maybe I'm getting used to it. That's how it works with smells, they disappear even when they're still there. Your nose stops noticing, but the pine remains constant, insistent. It reminds me of something I should remember. A camping trip, a Christmas tree, or something else entirely. I close my eyes and try to reconstruct the morning. I came into the house through the front door, that much I'm sure of. The key turned easily, too easily, like the lock had been expecting me. The hallway was dark, but light spilled from the living room doorway. And then I was here, standing by this window, breathing in pine and cigarettes and the weight of something unfinished. My sister's voice echoes again, "Promise me you'll remember." But remember what? The conversation feels important, urgent, like a message delivered in a language I used to speak but have somehow forgotten. I promised her something, or maybe she promised me something. The words tangle together in my memory like fishing line. The ashtray bothers me, not just because it appeared or because I noticed it, but because of how the cigarettes are arranged. Deliberate, intentional, like someone was making a point or leaving a sign. My sister always was dramatic, always speaking in symbols and gestures instead of plain words, but this feels different, final. I move away from the window and the floorboards protest under my weight. Each step sounds too loud in the stillness. The grandfather clock hasn't moved, its frozen hand still points to that nameless moment between numbers. I approach it slowly, like it might startle and run away. Up close, I can see dust on its face, tiny particles dancing in the morning light. There's something behind the clock, a piece of paper, folded small and wedged between the clock and the wall. My fingers shake as I pull it free. The paper is soft with age, and when I unfold it, I recognize the handwriting immediately. My sister's careful script, each letter formed with the precision of someone who has something important to say. But I can't read it, not because the ink has faded or the paper is damaged, but because my eyes won't focus on the words. They swim and blur like they're underwater. I fold the paper again and slip it into my pocket, where it feels heavier than it should. The pine smell is calling me back to the window. I resist at first, but my feet carry me there anyway. The tree outside seems closer now, its branches reaching toward the glass like fingers. Some of the needles are green and fresh, others brown and dying. The natural cycle of things, but it feels like a metaphor for something I can't quite grasp. I remember my sister standing here once, smoking and staring out at that tree. She said something about how pine trees never really die, they just shed their old selves and grow new parts. Like people, she said, like memories. I didn't understand what she meant then. I'm not sure I understand now. The morning light is shifting, growing warmer and more golden. How long have I been standing here? The question feels important, but I can't find an answer. Time moves differently in this house, like it's been stretched or compressed by some invisible force. The broken clock doesn't help, it offers no reference point, no anchor to the normal world. I think about the window again, how it was open when I arrived. Did someone leave it that way on purpose? An invitation or an escape route? The pine-scented air flows through it like a river, carrying messages I can't decode. My sister always said that houses breathe, that they need air to stay alive. Maybe she opened the window for the house's sake, not for her own. The cigarette butts in the ashtray are calling to me now. I walk over and examine them more closely. Each one is smoked down to almost nothing, consumed with the patience of someone who had time to kill. The lipstick stains are bright and fresh-looking, like they were left recently. But that's impossible, isn't it? I pick up one of the butts and hold it to the light. The paper is thin and expensive, the kind my sister preferred. She always said cheap cigarettes were like cheap promises, they burned too fast and left a bitter taste. These are her brand, her shade of lipstick, her way of smoking them down to the very end. The photograph on the mantel is calling to me again. I walk over and straighten the frame, and the people in the picture come into clearer focus. It's definitely me, but from years ago. The other person is my sister, but something about her face looks wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different. Like she's trying to tell me something with her expression, some urgent message that the camera captured but I missed. Behind us in the photograph is a car I don't recognize. Dark-colored, nondescript, the kind of vehicle that blends into traffic and disappears from memory. But why don't I remember it? The car seems important somehow, like a piece of a puzzle I've been trying to solve without knowing what the final picture should look like. I turn back to the window and the pine smell hits me with fresh intensity. It's not just coming from the tree outside, it's embedded in the room itself, in the walls and floorboards and furniture. Like the house has been marinating in it for a long time. Like it's become part of the structure, part of the story. The note in my pocket feels warm against my leg. I want to read it, but I'm afraid of what it might say. Some truths are better left buried, some messages better left undelivered. But my sister wouldn't have hidden it behind the clock unless it was important, unless it was something I needed to know. I pull out the paper and unfold it again. This time the words come into focus slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Her handwriting is careful and deliberate. The window was always open. You just forgot how to see it. The meaning hits me like cold water. I look at the window again and suddenly I understand. It wasn't open that morning, it had been open all along. I just hadn't noticed, hadn't remembered, hadn't wanted to see. The pine smell, the cigarettes, the frozen clock, they're all part of something larger, something I've been avoiding for so long that it became invisible. My sister is gone, that much is clear now, though I can't remember exactly when or how. The cigarettes in the ashtray are the last ones she smoked. The window is open because she wanted the house to breathe after she left, and the clock stopped at the moment she walked out of my life for the final time. But there's more to it than that. The car in the photograph, the deliberate arrangement of the cigarette butts, the note hidden behind the clock, they're all clues to something I'm supposed to understand. Something I promised to remember but chose to forget. I walk back to the window and lean out, breathing in the pine-scented air. The tree's branches brush against my face, and for a moment I feel like my sister is there with me, smoking her thin cigarettes and speaking in riddles. "You never listen," she said, but maybe I'm listening now. Maybe it's not too late to hear what she was trying to tell me. The morning light continues to shift and change, and I realize I could stand here forever, breathing in pine and memories and the weight of unfinished conversations. The house holds its secrets close, but it's willing to share them with those patient enough to wait, persistent enough to keep asking the right questions. The grandfather clock ticks on, its hand still frozen between moments, and I understand that some things are meant to remain suspended in time. Some truths are too fragile for the harsh light of complete understanding. Some windows, once opened, can never really be closed again. The scent of fresh pine continues to flow through the room, mixing with the fading aroma of cigarettes, carrying with it the promise that some mysteries are meant to be lived with rather than solved. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to keep the window open and wait for the truth to find its own way in Story 3. The warehouse was accessed at 600 hours. Inventory logs indicated all items were accounted for at the last scheduled check. Shelves remained orderly with no signs of forced entry or tampering. Pallet J recorded a 5% weight discrepancy despite the scanner showing a full readout. The entryway camera footage looped without interruptions, displaying no activity from midnight until the morning. The floor was swept clean. No loose packaging materials were detected. But the outgoing shipment count exceeded incoming receipts. No signature validated the dispatch form. Air circulation was normal, yet the temperature was unusually elevated. All seals were intact, though the scent of rubber was noted. No anomalies were documented, except for the missing timestamp on the last log entry. I know these words by heart now. I've read them so many times the paper has grown soft between my fingers, the edges worn down like worry stones. The official report sits on my kitchen table, coffee rings staining the margins, and I wonder if anyone else notices what I notice. The way the sentences don't quite fit together. The way certain details feel too precise while others drift into vagueness. The scent of rubber, that's what keeps pulling me back. I worked that warehouse for 3 years before everything changed. 3 years of the same routine, the same faces, the same industrial smell that clung to my clothes and followed me home. It was honest work, predictable work, the kind that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. I knew every aisle, every pallet position, every quirk of the old building's personality. But memory is a strange thing. The more I try to reconstruct those final weeks, the more the details seem to shift and blur. Was it a Tuesday when I first noticed the temperature gauge reading higher than usual? Or was that the Wednesday when the new supervisor started asking questions about shipping protocols? The timeline fractures when I pressed too hard against it. I remember the morning meetings growing longer, more pointed. The way conversations would stop when I entered the break room, then resume with forced casualness. Small things that might mean nothing or everything. There was a rhythm to the work that I'd grown to love. The scanner's beep, the hydraulic whisper of the forklift, the satisfying thunk of boxes settling into place. Even the building's sighs and creaks had become familiar music. So when that rhythm began to change, I felt it before I understood it. The weight discrepancies started small, a pound here, 2 pounds there, easy to dismiss as calibration errors or moisture absorption, the kind of minor variations that happen in any large operation, but they clustered around certain pallets, certain shipments, always the ones that came through on the overnight shift, when the skeleton crew worked under different supervision. I started keeping my own logs, nothing official, just notes scribbled on the back of shipping forms, weights, times, truck numbers, a pattern that might not be a pattern. The data accumulated slowly, like sediment, until I could see the shape of something underneath. The supervisor's name was on all the forms, but I rarely saw him during my shift. He was a shadow figure who worked the margins, arriving early or staying late, always just out of sync with the regular crew. When we did cross paths, he had a way of looking through me that made me feel transparent, unimportant, forgettable. Maybe that was intentional. The rubber smell was strongest near the loading dock. Industrial, chemical, with an undertone of something organic that I couldn't identify. It wasn't there every morning, just sometimes. Random enough that I began to wonder if I was imagining it. The mind can play tricks when you're looking for signs that might not exist. I started arriving earlier, staying later, watching. The overnight crew was small, efficient, professional. Nothing unusual in their movements or procedures, but there were moments when I felt like I was seeing only the surface of something deeper, a play performed for an audience of one. The camera system was old but functional, standard coverage of all the main areas with blind spots that everyone knew about. Those gaps in surveillance weren't secrets, just practical limitations of an aging infrastructure. Normal, expected, until you start wondering what might be happening in the spaces between the lenses. I found myself studying the footage during my breaks, scrolling through hours of empty corridors and static warehouse views, looking for anomalies that the official review had missed or chosen not to see. The loops were seamless, professional, too professional maybe, for equipment that usually hiccuped and stuttered through its daily routine. The temperature elevation was subtle but consistent, 5 degrees above normal in the southeast section where the overnight shipments were staged. The HVAC system showed no malfunctions, no blocked vents or failing units, just warmth where there should have been coolness, heat without an apparent source. I began to understand that I was seeing the edges of something larger, a system within the system, operating by different rules. The weight discrepancies weren't errors but evidence. The missing timestamps weren't oversights but erasures. The rubber smell wasn't random but residual. But understanding and proving are different things entirely. The investigation began quietly. Internal audit, they called it, routine compliance check, nothing to worry about, but I could feel the tension building like pressure behind a dam. Conversations became more careful, procedures more rigid, the easy camaraderie of the workplace replaced by something watchful and wary. I wasn't supposed to be involved in the investigation, but I found ways to stay informed. Fragments of conversation, documents left briefly unattended, the careful body language of people carrying secrets. The picture that emerged was incomplete but troubling. Shipments that existed only on paper. Inventory that moved without leaving traces. A ghost operation running parallel to the legitimate business. The supervisor disappeared between shifts. One morning he simply wasn't there, his office cleaned out, his access codes deactivated. No announcement, no explanation, just an absence where a presence used to be. The kind of quiet departure that raises more questions than answers. I kept waiting for someone to contact me, to ask about my observations, my informal logs, my growing certainty that something significant had been happening under our noses. But the investigation seemed to flow around me like water around a stone. I was invisible to the process, irrelevant to the outcome. The official report arrived weeks later, clean, professional, inconclusive. A masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity that acknowledged irregularities while avoiding implications. The kind of document that says everything and nothing, that satisfies no one while protecting everyone. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I felt in the changed rhythm of the place. I thought I understood. The rubber scent that lingered in the loading dock wasn't from the trucks or the machinery. It was from something else, something that left no other traces except for weight discrepancies and missing timestamps and the subtle wrongness that only comes from lies told with professional skill. Sometimes I drive past the warehouse, though I don't work there anymore. The building looks the same from the outside, but I know that appearances can be deceiving. The loading dock is active, trucks coming and going, the business of commerce continuing as it always has. Normal operations hiding whatever abnormal operations might still be running beneath the surface. The scent of rubber still haunts my memory, industrial, chemical, with that organic undertone I never could identify. It clings to my recollections like smoke, a sensory anchor for all the questions that remain unanswered. Evidence of something that officially never happened, in a place where all anomalies have been explained away. I understand now that some investigations are designed not to find the truth, but to bury it. That reports can be weapons of misdirection, using facts to obscure rather than illuminate. The warehouse was accessed at 600 hours, and everything was exactly as it should have been. Except for the parts that weren't and the questions that nobody wanted to ask, and the scent of rubber that still rises from the page whenever I read those familiar words again. Story 4. My presence was a mere silhouette against the stillness of the room, each second stretching into the next with no intention of release. The clock ticked in uneven intervals, the pattern elusive in its rhythm. An unsettled silence crept through the seams of the walls, pressing against my ears as if waiting to whisper secrets. I watched the curtains, expectant but unmoving, as the air swelled with an undecipherable promise. Instinctively, my gaze drifted to the floor, searching for a misplaced shadow, a line that felt drawn but never finished. And then I noticed the doorknob slightly turned, reflecting a light that shouldn't have been. The brass surface catches something from outside, or maybe from within. I can't tell anymore. The reflection moves without my moving, shifts without cause. My fingers trace the edge of the table where I've spread the photographs again, though I told myself I wouldn't, not today. The paper feels thin beneath my touch, worn from handling, from staring, from trying to extract meaning from shadows and angles that refuse to yield their secrets. There's a woman in the third photograph. I think there's a woman. The image blurs at the edges, and sometimes when I look directly at her, she seems to dissolve into the grain of the film itself. But in my peripheral vision, she solidifies, becomes real, becomes important. I remember the detective's voice, how it carried through the precinct like smoke. "The thing about missing persons cases," he said, though I'm not certain he was speaking to me, "is that people don't always want to be found." His words loop through my mind now, distorted by repetition and time. Did he say missing persons, or did he say missing pieces? The distinction feels crucial, though I can't grasp why. The room grows smaller as evening approaches, or maybe it's morning. The light through the window holds that ambiguous quality that belongs to neither dawn nor dusk, suspended in a moment that could be either beginning or ending. I've lost track of how long I've been sitting here, how many times I've arranged and rearranged these fragments of evidence that may not be evidence at all. My notebook lies open beside the photographs. The pages are covered with my handwriting, though some of the entries feel foreign, as if written by someone else's hand. The ink changes color mid-sentence sometimes. Blue to black to blue again. I don't remember switching pens. Entry from what I believe was Tuesday. The neighbor mentioned seeing someone in the garden, late after the streetlights came on, but when pressed for details, her description shifted, first tall, then short, first walking, then standing perfectly still. Entry from an unknown date. Checked the garden myself, found nothing. But the soil looked disturbed, though it could have been from rain. Everything looks disturbed after rain. Entry from yesterday, or perhaps tomorrow. The woman in the photograph might not be a woman at all, might be a shadow cast by something else entirely. How do you investigate a shadow? I close the notebook and immediately open it again. The pages have changed, or my memory of what I wrote has changed. Both possibilities feel equally plausible and equally impossible. The doorknob continues to reflect its mysterious light. I stand and approach it, my footsteps muffled by the carpet that wasn't there this morning. Or was it? The brass feels cold under my palm, colder than the room's temperature would suggest. I turn it slowly, expecting resistance, but it moves easily, too easily, as if it was never truly closed. The hallway beyond stretches in both directions, longer than the building should allow. The walls are lined with doors, each identical to the one I've just opened, each reflecting the same impossible light. I choose left, though the decision feels arbitrary, predetermined by forces I don't understand. The first door I try is locked. The second opens onto a room identical to the one I just left, complete with the same photograph spread across the same table. But the woman in the third photograph is gone. The space where she stood, or where I thought she stood, is empty except for a smudge of darkness that could be anything. I hear voices from somewhere deeper in the building. Conversation without words, meaning without language. The sound draws me forward past more doors, more reflections, more rooms that might be the same rooms seen from different angles. The detective's office was smaller than I expected, his desk cluttered with files that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking directly at them. Coffee stains formed patterns on the wood surface, maps of territories I couldn't identify. "Tell me again about the garden," he said, though I wasn't sure I had told him about it before. I described what I had seen or thought I had seen, the disturbed soil, the sense of presence without presence, the feeling that something had been removed rather than added. "And you were there because..." The question hung in the air between us. I had an answer, I was certain I had an answer, but when I reached for it, my mind came up empty. Why had I been in the garden? What had drawn me there in the first place? "I live nearby," I said, though as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. He made a note in a file that might have been about me, or about someone else entirely. The pen scratched against the paper with a sound like footsteps on gravel. "Missing persons cases," he said again, and this time I was certain he was speaking to me, "require patience. Sometimes the truth reveals itself slowly. Sometimes it doesn't reveal itself at all." Back in the hallway, I've lost track of which door leads back to my room. They all look identical, and when I try the handles, some open onto spaces I've never seen before. A kitchen with dishes still warm on the counter. A bedroom with sheets that smell like sleep and dreams. A bathroom where the mirror reflects someone who might be me, but older or younger or simply different in ways I can't articulate. I find myself in a library, though I don't remember opening a door. The shelves stretch impossibly high, filled with books whose titles shift when I'm not reading them directly. I pull one at random and open it to find pages covered with my own handwriting, though I don't remember writing any of it. The text describes a woman who disappeared on a Tuesday or a Thursday, or perhaps she never disappeared at all. Perhaps she was never there to begin with. The details contradict themselves from paragraph to paragraph. Her hair is blonde, then brown, then the color of shadows. She lived alone, with a cat, with a family, with no one at all. I read my own words and feel like a stranger encountering someone else's memories. The investigation began, according to my notes, when I noticed her absence. But how do you notice the absence of someone you're not sure existed? The logic circles back on itself, a snake consuming its own tail. I interviewed the neighbors, though I have no memory of these conversations. Yet here they are, transcribed in my handwriting. She kept to herself mostly, but you'd see her in the garden sometimes, just standing there, like she was waiting for something. "I never saw her at all. Are you sure she lived here?" "Oh yes, lovely woman. We used to chat over the fence, though I can't recall what we talked about. There's no house there, just an empty lot, has been for years." Each statement feels true and false simultaneously. The contradictions don't resolve, they multiply, breeding new impossibilities with each reading. I close the book and find another, then another. They all contain the same story told from different angles, with different details, different outcomes. In one version, the woman is found safe, living quietly in another town. In another, she never existed at all, was a collective hallucination born from the neighborhood's need for mystery. In a third, she is found in the garden beneath the disturbed soil, though she is somehow still alive, still waiting, still watching from windows that no longer exist. The library fades around me, or perhaps I fade from it. I'm back in the hallway, or a hallway that looks identical to the one I remember. The doors stretch endlessly in both directions, each one a possibility, each one a dead end. I choose a door at random and find myself in the detective's office again, though it's different now. Smaller or larger or simply arranged differently. The coffee stains on his desk have formed new patterns, new territories of meaning I can't decipher. The thing about investigations, he says, though I don't remember him speaking, is that sometimes you find what you're looking for. Sometimes you find something else entirely, and sometimes what you find finds you first. His words echo strangely in the space, as if the room itself is trying to remember how sound works. I ask him about the woman, though I'm not sure I speak aloud. He shuffles through files that seem to reorganize themselves as he touches them. Which woman, he asks, and the question contains multitudes. I describe her or try to, but the words feel inadequate, like trying to paint with colors that don't exist. She is tall and short, young and old, present and absent. She is every woman and no woman, a composite of possibilities that refuse to coalesce into a single truth. He nods as if this makes perfect sense. Those are the hardest cases, he says, when the evidence points in all directions at once, when every light leads back to the beginning. I leave his office, though I don't remember standing up or walking to the door. The hallway has changed again, or my perception of it has changed. The doors are numbered now, though the numbers don't follow any sequence I recognize. 7, 23, 2, 91, 4, 156. I try door 7 and find myself in the garden. The soil is still disturbed, or disturbed again, or perhaps it was never disturbed at all. The shadows fall at angles that suggest a time of day that doesn't exist, cast by objects I can't identify. I kneel and touch the earth, feeling for something I can't name. My fingers encounter resistance, something buried just beneath the surface. I dig carefully, expecting to find evidence, answers, closure. Instead, I uncover a photograph, though it's somehow dry despite being buried in damp soil. It's the same photograph from my room, the one with the woman who may or may not be a woman. But now she's facing the other direction, looking toward something outside the frame. Her expression, if it is an expression, suggests recognition, as if she's seeing someone she knows. I turn around, following her gaze, and see myself standing in the window of a building that wasn't there moments before. But it's not quite myself. The figure in the window is taller, or shorter, or simply different in ways that make my skin crawl with recognition. The figure waves, and I feel my own hand rise in response, though I don't remember deciding to wave back. I'm back in my room, though I don't remember leaving the garden. The photographs are still spread across the table, but they've changed. The woman is in different positions in each one, as if she's moving through a sequence of moments I wasn't present to witness. In the first photograph, she's walking toward the camera. In the second, she's standing still, looking directly at the lens. In the third, she's walking away. In the fourth, she's gone, leaving only an empty space that somehow feels more significant than her presence ever did. I arrange the photographs in different orders, trying to find the sequence that makes sense, but sense seems to be a luxury I can no longer afford. Each arrangement tells a different story, and all the stories are true, and none of them are true. My notebook has filled itself with new entries while I wasn't looking. The investigation is investigating itself now. I am both the detective and the suspect, the observer and the observed. Found evidence of my own presence in places I don't remember being. footprints in mud that match my shoes, fingerprints on surfaces I've never touched. The woman in the photograph is me, has always been me, will always be me. This last entry is written in handwriting I don't recognize, though it's somehow still mine. The doorknob continues to reflect its impossible light, and I realize now that the light is coming from inside the room, not outside. It's emanating from the photographs themselves, from the spaces between what is and what might be. I gather the photographs and hold them up to the light, looking for hidden details, secret messages, clues that will unlock the mystery I've been pursuing. But as I watch, the images begin to fade, becoming transparent, then translucent, then invisible entirely. I'm left holding blank pieces of paper that feel heavy, with meaning I can no longer access. The room around me starts to shift, walls breathing like living things, furniture rearranging itself according to rules I don't understand. The clock on the wall ticks backward, then forward, then stops entirely, its hands pointing to a time that doesn't exist. I realize I've been here before, will be here again, am here always. The investigation has no beginning and no end, only an eternal middle where questions multiply faster than answers and truth becomes a luxury I can no longer afford to believe in. The detective's voice echoes from somewhere that might be memory or might be prophecy. The thing about missing persons cases is that sometimes the person who's missing is the one doing the looking. I understand now, or think I do, though understanding feels like another kind of confusion. I am the woman in the photograph, the investigator, the mystery itself. I am missing and found simultaneously, present in my own absence, absent in my own presence. The doorknob turns without my touching it, and the door opens onto the same room I'm already in. I step through and find myself stepping through again, an endless loop of investigation and discovery that leads nowhere and everywhere at once. The light that shouldn't have been continues to reflect in the brass surface, and I realize it's been reflecting me all along, showing me versions of myself I didn't know existed, couldn't have imagined, will never fully understand. I sit back down at the table where the photographs used to be, where they still are, where they never were. My notebook opens itself to a blank page, and I begin to write, though I don't know what story I'm telling or who I'm telling it to. The words appear on the page as if written by someone else's hand, though the pen is mine, the thoughts are mine, the confusion and clarity are mine. The case remains open, will always remain open, must always remain open, because the moment it closes, the moment I stop looking, is the moment I disappear entirely. Outside the window or inside the window or in the space between inside and outside, I see the garden where it all began, or where it all ends, or where it all continues without beginning or ending. The soil is disturbed or undisturbed or disturbed in ways that suggest disturbance without cause. Someone is standing there, or no one is standing there, or everyone is standing there at once. The figure might be the woman from the photograph, might be the detective, might be me, might be all of us or none of us. They wave and I wave back, and the gesture feels like a greeting and a goodbye and a question all at once. The clock ticks in patterns that spell out messages I can't decode, and the curtains move without wind, and the doorknob reflects light that comes from everywhere and nowhere. I am here investigating my own disappearance, discovering my own presence, losing myself in the act of finding myself. The story continues, will always continue, must always continue. Because some investigations never end. They just change investigators. Story 5. It used to tick without fail, beating a steady rhythm in the quiet of my apartment. Every evening, like the echo of a heartbeat, the old clock above my mantel would chime twice at 7:30. I rarely glanced up. Its sound was as much a part of my routine as brushing my teeth. Last Friday, however, the chime was late, as if hesitant. I caught myself waiting, listening to the silence stretch longer than it should. Tonight, it skipped the first chime completely, lurching to the second as if recovering from a stumble. The hands look unchanged, but something in the room feels different, like a warning I can't quite grasp. The brass pendulum catches the lamplight, casting shadows that dance across the wall like fingers reaching. I remember staring at those same shadows months ago when the detective called about the case. The way her voice cracked slightly when she said they were closing the file. No new leads, no resolution, just another name in a folder that would gather dust in some basement archive. But that's not how it started, is it? No, it began with the photograph. Or maybe it began with the woman in the coffee shop who wouldn't stop staring at my hands. She sat 3 tables away, her cup growing cold while she watched me turn pages in a book I wasn't really reading. When I looked up, she'd already gone, leaving only a folded napkin on her table. The waitress swept it away before I could see what, if anything, was written on it. I think about that napkin more than I should, the way it was folded, precise and deliberate, like the corners of evidence bags, like the way she used to fold her letters before hiding them in places no one would think to look. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because the mail comes late on Tuesdays, and I was already in my pajamas when I heard the slot creak open. A manila envelope with no return address, my name typed on a label that looked professionally printed. Inside, a single black and white image, a woman walking away from the camera down a tree-lined street, her hair caught in mid-swing, one hand reaching up to tuck a strand behind her ear. I knew that gesture, had seen it 1,000 times across dinner tables, in movie theaters, during conversations that lasted until dawn. But the woman in the photograph was supposed to be dead. The detective was younger than I expected, freckles across her nose, hands that moved constantly while she talked, tapping against her coffee cup or straightening papers that didn't need straightening. She asked about the last time I'd seen her, about our relationship, about whether I believed the official story. Her questions felt rehearsed, like she'd asked them before about other cases, other missing people who turned up in rivers or shallow graves or not at all. Sometimes families send photographs, she said, not meeting my eyes. Old ones they find in boxes. The mind plays tricks when grief is involved. We see what we need to see. But this wasn't an old photograph. The cars in the background were too new, the street signs too crisp. And there was something else, something I couldn't articulate then, but feel now in the way the clock's rhythm has changed. A wrongness in the details that should have been right. I started walking that street every morning, not searching exactly, more like hoping to catch an echo of something that had already passed. The trees were different than in the photograph, fuller somehow, as if months had gone by since the image was captured. Or maybe I was remembering it wrong. Memory is unreliable, the detective had said. It edits itself, removes inconsistencies, fills in gaps with what seems most likely to be true. The coffee shop woman appeared again 3 weeks later. Same table, same cold cup, same intense focus on my movements. This time I approached her before she could leave. "Do I know you?" I asked. She looked up with eyes that seemed familiar but wrong, like a song played in a different key. "I think you knew my sister." Past tense, the words hung between us like smoke. I sat down without being invited, studying her face for resemblances I might have missed. The shape of her mouth, maybe, the way she held her shoulders. She wrote about you, the woman continued. In letters she sent me, she said you had gentle hands. I looked down at my hands resting on the small table between us. They seemed ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of hands that belonged to someone who worked at a desk, who typed reports and filed papers and lived a life of comfortable routine, not the hands of someone who might have been the last person to see a woman alive. "What happened to her?" I asked. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's what I'm trying to figure out. She left without another word, and I realized I'd never asked her name or her sister's name. The conversation felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story I'd overheard and somehow inserted myself into. But her words stayed with me. Gentle hands, as if gentleness were something that could be seen, measured, trusted. The letters started arriving after that, not addressed to me, but left in places I would find them, tucked under my windshield wiper, slipped between books at the library, folded inside my morning newspaper, each one written in the same careful handwriting, each one signed with just an initial that could have been any letter of the alphabet. "He thinks I don't know about the photographs," one letter read, "but I've seen them hidden in his desk drawer, pictures of women who look like me, taken from a distance, always walking away, always unaware of being watched." Another, "The coffee tastes different lately, bitter with an aftertaste that lingers. I've started making my own, but he insists on bringing me a cup each morning. Such a thoughtful gesture," he says, "such a caring man." And I dreamed about drowning again. The water was warm, almost welcoming, but I woke up with dirt under my fingernails and no memory of gardening. Each letter felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving, but the pieces didn't fit together in any way that made sense. The handwriting was consistent, but the experiences described seemed to belong to different people, different lives, or maybe the same life viewed from different angles, like photographs taken with a broken lens. I brought the letters to the detective. She read them carefully, her hands finally still for once, then looked at me with something that might have been pity. "These could be fiction," she said, "creative writing exercises or therapy assignments. There's nothing here that definitively connects to our case." Our case, as if I were part of the investigation rather than simply someone who'd received an anonymous photograph and started seeing connections where none existed. But I appreciated the inclusion, the suggestion that my obsession had some official weight. "What about the handwriting analysis?" I asked. "We'd need a confirmed sample to compare it to, and even then, handwriting can be disguised, imitated. These letters could have been written by anyone." Anyone, including me, was the implication, including someone whose grief had transformed into something more active, more creative, someone who might stage their own mystery to avoid accepting a simpler, more painful truth. But I knew I hadn't written the letters, didn't I? The clock chimes again, startling me back to the present. Both chimes this time, but the spacing between them feels wrong, too long, as if the mechanism is struggling with some internal resistance. I wonder if something has shifted inside the case, some gear or spring working loose after years of faithful service. Or maybe the change is in me, in the way I'm listening. Maybe I've become hypersensitive to disruptions in patterns I used to take for granted. I remember the last conversation we had, though I'm no longer certain it actually happened. We were sitting in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that needed cleaning. She was making tea, moving through the familiar ritual with the kind of automatic grace that comes from repetition. but her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. "I think someone's been in the house," she said, not looking at me. Small things moved, books opened to different pages, the coffee canister refilled when I know it was nearly empty. I suggested she change the locks, maybe install a security system. Practical solutions to what seemed like a practical problem, but she shook her head, still focused on the tea preparation. "It's not that kind of intrusion," she said. "It's more subtle, like someone learning my routines, studying my habits, preparing for something." The tea was too strong when she finally served it, bitter with an aftertaste that lingered. I drank it anyway, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but I found myself wondering later if the bitterness had been intentional, if she'd been testing my reaction to something I couldn't identify. Or maybe that conversation never happened at all. Maybe it's a composite memory built from fragments of the letters and my own growing paranoia. The mind plays tricks when grief is involved, the detective had said. We see what we need to see. But what did I need to see? What story was I constructing from these disconnected pieces? I started visiting the library more often, reading about missing persons cases, unsolved disappearances. The patterns were depressingly consistent. Someone vanishes, usually a woman, usually someone whose absence isn't immediately noticed. The investigation follows predictable channels, interviews with family and friends, searches of likely locations, appeals for public information. Most cases go cold within months. The missing person becomes a statistic, a file number, a photograph on a bulletin board that gets updated with more recent tragedies. But some cases remain active in unofficial ways. Families hire private investigators. Friends create websites dedicated to keeping the memory alive. And sometimes people like me receive anonymous photographs and start constructing elaborate theories about what might have happened. The librarian began to recognize me, nodding when I arrived and directing me toward the true crime section without being asked. She was an older woman with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. Kind eyes, but watchful. The kind of person who noticed patterns in borrowing habits, who might remember which books had been checked out by whom. "Research project," she asked one afternoon, finding me surrounded by open volumes about forensic investigation techniques. "Something like that," I said. She smiled knowingly. "We get a lot of amateur detectives in here. People trying to solve cold cases, usually ones with some personal connection. It's admirable, really, the dedication to finding truth. But what if the truth was something I didn't want to find? What if the gentle hands the coffee shop woman had mentioned weren't as innocent as they appeared? What if the last person to see someone alive had reasons for not reporting the encounter immediately? The questions multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors, each one generating new possibilities, new doubts. I found myself questioning memories I'd always considered reliable, wondering if my version of events had been edited over time to remove inconsistencies that might implicate me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. The photograph remained on my kitchen table, propped against a bowl of fruit that was slowly going bad. I studied it obsessively, looking for details I might have missed. The angle of her shoulders, the pattern of shadows on the sidewalk, the make and model of cars visible in the background. Each element seemed significant and meaningless simultaneously, like words in a language I almost but didn't quite understand. And then I noticed something that changed everything, or maybe nothing at all. In the lower right corner of the photograph, Barely visible among the shadows cast by parked cars was the edge of another shadow, human-shaped but distorted, as if the person casting it had been standing very close to the photographer, close enough to be collaborating rather than simply observing. I brought the photograph to a shop that specialized in image enhancement, the kind of place that advertised services for insurance investigators and legal proceedings. The technician was professional but curious, asking casual questions about the context while he worked. I gave vague answers about family history research, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The enhanced image revealed what I'd suspected and feared. The shadow belonged to someone holding what appeared to be a camera or phone, positioned to capture the same scene from a slightly different angle. Two photographers working in coordination, but why, and who was the second person? The coffee shop woman was waiting for me when I got home, sitting on the steps outside my building. She looked different in the evening light, older somehow, with lines around her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe the stress of whatever she was investigating had aged her in the weeks since our last conversation. "I found something," she said without preamble, "something that connects your story to mine." She handed me a manila envelope similar to the one that had contained the original photograph. Inside were photocopies of what appeared to be police reports, heavily redacted but still legible enough to follow the basic narrative. A missing person case from several states away. A woman who disappeared after telling friends she was meeting someone she'd been corresponding with. Someone who'd written her letters signed only with an initial. The missing woman's description matched the figure in my photograph. Height, build, the distinctive way of moving that I'd recognized but couldn't place. But according to the police report, she'd vanished months before the photograph had been taken. "How is this possible?" I asked. The woman looked at me with those familiar but wrong eyes. "I think someone's been collecting us," she said. "People connected to her case, feeding us information, manipulating our perceptions, making us complicit in our own investigation." Complicit, the word carried implications I wasn't ready to examine, but it explained the feeling I'd had throughout this entire experience, the sense that I was both observer and participant, both investigator and suspect. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want you to remember," she said, "really remember, not the version you've constructed to protect yourself, but what actually happened the last time you saw her." And suddenly I did remember, or thought I did, the conversation in her kitchen, but different from how I'd been picturing it. She hadn't been making tea. She'd been packing, folding clothes into a suitcase with the same careful precision she'd used for everything else. And I hadn't been offering practical advice about security systems. I'd been trying to convince her to stay. "You don't understand," she'd said, not looking at me. "It's not safe here anymore. Someone's been watching, learning my routines. I have to disappear before they decide to act." But I'd insisted she was overreacting, that her fears were symptoms of stress rather than genuine threats. I'd offered to help her feel safer, to check the locks and stay the night if necessary. Such a caring gesture, I'd said, such a thoughtful man. The memory felt real and false simultaneously, like something I'd experienced and something I'd been told I'd experienced. But the emotions attached to it were undeniably mine. The frustration of not being believed, the hurt of being pushed away, the anger at being treated like a threat when I'd only wanted to help. Or had I wanted something else entirely? The clock chimes again, and this time I count 3 strikes instead of 2. Either it's later than I thought, or the mechanism is becoming increasingly unreliable. Time feels elastic lately, stretching and contracting without warning. Conversations that seemed to last hours might have been brief exchanges. Days that felt significant might have been dreams. I'm holding the enhanced photograph now, studying the shadow that reveals a second photographer. The shape is ambiguous, could belong to anyone, but there's something familiar about the posture, the way the shoulders are held. Something that reminds me of my own reflection in store windows, my own silhouette cast by streetlights. The letters have stopped coming. The coffee shop woman hasn't appeared in weeks. Even the detective seems to have moved on to more promising cases, more cooperative witnesses. I'm alone with my questions and my unreliable memories, trying to distinguish between what happened and what I needed to happen. But maybe that distinction doesn't matter anymore. Maybe the truth isn't something that exists independently of my perception of it. Maybe the story I've constructed is the only truth that remains accessible, even if it's built from fragments of reality and necessity in equal measure. The clock falls silent, its pendulum finally still. In the sudden quiet, I can hear other sounds I'd been ignoring. Footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, the soft click of a camera shutter, the rustle of papers being slipped under my door. The investigation continues, but I'm no longer certain whether I'm conducting it or subject to it. I think about gentle hands and bitter coffee, about photographs that capture impossible moments and letters that arrive from no one. About the woman in the image who walks away from the camera, always walking away, never turning to reveal her face or acknowledge the watchers who document her passage. And I wonder if she's still walking somewhere, through other photographs taken by other shadows, followed by other gentle hands that mean only to help, only to care, only to preserve some trace of her existence before she disappears completely into the space between memory and imagination, where all our lost connections eventually reside. The silence stretches, no longer measured by chimes or heartbeats. Just the weight of unanswered questions and the growing certainty that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some truths too fragile to survive the investigation they demand. But I keep the photograph on my table anyway, propped against the bowl of rotting fruit, a reminder of something that might have happened, might still be happening, might never have happened at all. The woman continues her eternal walk away from the camera, and I continue watching, waiting for her to turn around and explain everything, knowing she never will. Story 6. The window shutters were drawn, yet faint dust motes drifted visible in the morning air. Initial entry noted no immediate disturbances in the foyer, furniture aligned, surfaces uncluttered. An open book lay face down on a pristine coffee table. Kitchen inventory revealed one plate, spotless as if unused, and a solitary fork in the drying rack. The refrigerator emitted a continuous hum, its door ajar but condensation absent. Upstairs, drawers were systematically arranged, each item accounted to precision, while the bed displayed tightly pulled sheets with no indentations. Anomalous footprints outlined in dust led directly to a locked attic door. However, no footsteps preceded them. That hum, I keep coming back to that hum. Not the refrigerator, something else, something mechanical and constant, like breathing that never stops. I hear it now when I close my eyes, when I try to piece together what happened in that house. The house I was supposed to investigate. The house that investigated me instead. I was a professional then. Badge, protocol, procedures. I followed the steps, document everything, touch nothing unnecessarily, preserve the scene. But which scene was I preserving, the one I found or the one that found me? The dust motes moved wrong. That's what I should have written in my report. Should have noted how they swirled in patterns too deliberate for random air currents. like someone had just walked through them, stirring them into perfect spirals, but the footprints only went one direction. I remember standing in that foyer, clipboard in hand, and feeling watched, not by eyes, by the house itself. The walls seemed to lean inward just slightly, as if the whole structure was holding its breath, waiting. The book on the coffee table, I never opened it. Protocol said photograph first, examine later, but I could see the impression where fingers had pressed against the pages. Recent impressions. The paper still held the slight curve of being handled, yet no one had been in that house for. How long had it been empty? The report said weeks. My memory says something different. My memory says the coffee in the kitchen was still warm, though I found no coffee maker. No mugs, just that single plate, gleaming like it had been polished rather than washed. I keep trying to remember who called it in, who reported the disturbance. The paperwork is gone now, or maybe I never filled it out properly. Maybe I never finished the job. Maybe the job finished me. The refrigerator door hung open like a mouth. That continuous hum wasn't coming from the motor. The motor was silent. The hum came from somewhere deeper in the house, somewhere I couldn't locate no matter how many rooms I checked. It followed me from floor to floor, always just behind the next wall, always just around the next corner. Upstairs felt different, cleaner, too clean, like someone had scrubbed away not just dirt but history itself. The drawers opened smoothly, no resistance, no wear on the handles despite being filled with belongings that looked lived in. Clothes folded with military precision, photographs face down in perfect rows. I turned one over. I should remember the face in that photograph. It feels important, like a key I'm supposed to recognize. But when I try to focus on the features, they blur, not the photograph, my memory. Like something inside my head refuses to let me see clearly. The bed bothered me most, sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a coin, but no one had slept there. No indentation on the pillow. No wrinkles where a body might have turned during the night. Yet the room smelled like sleep, like dreams and the particular staleness of morning breath. How do you explain that in a report? Those footprints leading to the attic door. Bare feet, adult-sized, perfectly preserved in a thin layer of dust. But the hallway behind them was clean. No trail leading to where the prints began. They simply appeared as if someone had materialized at that exact spot and walked directly to the locked door. I tested the lock, old-fashioned skeleton key type, but the metal was new, recently installed. The scratches around the keyhole were fresh, bright silver against the aged brass finish. Someone had been opening and closing this door regularly, recently. But no key anywhere in the house. I called for backup then, I think I did. The memory feels thin, like tissue paper held up to light. Maybe I called, maybe I just thought about calling. Maybe I stood at the bottom of those attic stairs and listened to that mechanical humming grow louder. The sound was coming from above. When I try to remember what happened next, my thoughts scatter like those dust motes, fragments of sensation without context, the feeling of climbing stairs that creaked under my weight, the smell of old wood and something else, something organic but not quite alive, the way my flashlight beam seemed to bend at the edges as if the darkness was thicker than it should be. Did I find a key? Did someone unlock the door from the inside? Did it simply open when I reached for the handle? I remember light, not electric light, natural light but wrong somehow, too bright for an attic space, too warm for the season. And that hum becoming a whisper, becoming almost like words I couldn't quite understand. There was someone up there, or something that had been someone, or maybe just the impression of someone, like those finger marks in the book downstairs. A presence pressed into the space itself, leaving traces that couldn't be photographed or documented or explained in any report. I should have left then, should have backed down those stairs and called for the kind of backup they don't list in any manual. But I was still thinking like a professional, still believing in procedures and protocols and the idea that every mystery has a logical solution. The attic was empty, completely empty, just bare floorboards and exposed rafters and that impossible light streaming through windows that shouldn't exist. But in the center of the space, another set of footprints. These ones leading in a circle, around and around, worn deep into the wood as if someone had walked that same path thousands of times. The humming stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the house settling around me like a living thing adjusting its position, could hear something else too, something that might have been breathing if breathing could come from the walls themselves. I don't remember leaving the attic, don't remember going back down those stairs or walking through those perfectly arranged rooms or stepping out into daylight that felt harsh after the strange glow above. My next clear memory is sitting in my car, engine running, looking back at a house that seemed somehow smaller than when I'd entered it. The report I filed was incomplete, had to be. How do you document the impossible? How do you explain footprints that lead nowhere, sounds with no source, light that defies physics? How do you write up a case where the evidence points to something that can't exist? I tried to go back, told myself I needed to complete the investigation, gather more evidence, make sense of what I'd experienced. But the house was gone, not demolished, gone. Empty lot, overgrown with weeds that looked like they'd been growing for years. No foundation, no indication that anything had ever stood there. The neighbors, when I asked, looked at me strangely, said the lot had been empty as long as they could remember, said they'd never seen any house there, never heard of any disturbance that would require investigation. But I still have the dust under my fingernails, still smell that particular mixture of old wood and something organic when the wind blows from that direction. Still hear that mechanical humming in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking. And sometimes when I'm not trying to remember, when my mind is focused on something else entirely, I catch glimpses of what was in that attic, not what I saw, what I felt. The presence that had worn those circular footprints into the floor, the thing that had been waiting in that impossible light. It wasn't waiting for rescue, wasn't trapped behind that locked door. It was waiting for someone like me, someone who would follow the clues, climb the stairs, open the door, someone who would complete the circuit, close the loop, become part of the pattern. I think about that single plate in the kitchen, how clean it was, how unused, like it was waiting for the next meal, the next visitor, the next person to sit at that pristine table and try to make sense of the impossible. I think about those dust motes swirling in patterns too perfect for chance, still swirling somewhere in some version of that house that exists just outside normal space, still marking the passage of something that walks without leaving footprints until it wants to be followed. The hum is getting louder now, not just in my memory, in my apartment, in my car, in the spaces between words when I try to tell this story. Growing stronger, more insistent, like a signal calling me back to complete what I started. And I'm beginning to understand that the investigation never ended, that some cases don't close, they just expand. Include more people, more places, more moments where the impossible blades through into the everyday world. The footprints I found in that attic weren't from a victim. They were from everyone who came before me. Everyone who followed the clues, opened the door, stepped into that circle of worn wood and impossible light. Now there's a new set of prints up there. Mine, waiting for the next investigator, the next person who thinks they can solve what can't be solved, document what can't be documented. And somewhere in a house that exists only when it needs to be found, that mechanical humming continues, patient, eternal, calling. The dust motes are still dancing. Story 7. The forgotten detail. The morning light trickled through the sheer curtains, casting a lattice of soft shadows on the parquet floor. A distant hum of traffic punctuated the silence like a forgotten whisper. In the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked steadily, except when it paused for a single beat, as if listening. The air held a peculiar chill, almost metallic, as though it had slipped in from another time. Everything seemed untouched, yet the clock's irregular heartbeat hinted at a presence waiting just out of sight. I stood in the doorway of what had been her apartment, breathing in that strange metallic scent that seemed to cling to everything. The police had finished their work weeks ago, but the landlord hadn't managed to rent it out yet. Something about the place kept potential tenants away after just a few minutes inside. I understood why. She had been my neighbor for 3 years. We shared morning nods in the hallway, brief conversations about the weather, complaints about the building's ancient heating system. Normal interactions between people who lived behind thin walls but remained strangers until she disappeared. The official report called it a missing person case. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no blood. Just an empty apartment with a half-eaten breakfast still on the kitchen table and a coffee cup that had grown cold. Her purse was gone, but her keys remained on the counter. Her bed was made, but her favorite sweater lay crumpled on the bathroom floor. I had been the one to call the police when her mail started overflowing. The superintendent let them in, and they found exactly what I just described. Nothing that screamed violence, everything that whispered wrong. The detective assigned to the case was a tired-looking woman with calloused hands who asked me the same questions 3 times in slightly different ways. Had I heard anything unusual? Had she mentioned feeling threatened? Did she have a boyfriend, family members, anyone who might know where she'd gone? My answers felt inadequate. I had heard her television playing late some nights, but that wasn't unusual. She had mentioned feeling watched once while checking her mail, but attributed it to the new tenant on the 3rd floor who seemed friendly enough. No boyfriend that I knew of, though she occasionally had visitors. A woman with a raspy laugh who smoked on the fire escape. A man who always wore the same brown jacket and left before dawn. The detective wrote everything down in a notebook that looked like it had survived multiple coffee spills and rainstorms. She promised to follow up on all leads, but her tone suggested she'd heard similar stories too many times before. That was 2 months ago. The investigation had gone cold, the detective had moved on to fresher cases, and the landlord was growing impatient. But I couldn't let it go. It started with small things. I found myself listening for sounds from her apartment that would never come. I noticed which of her plants the superintendent had removed and which had been left to wither on the fire escape. I began paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The brown jacket man had been back twice since she disappeared. Not to visit her, obviously, but I saw him in the neighborhood, once at the coffee shop on the corner, once walking past our building while talking intensely on his phone. Both times he seemed to be looking up at her windows. I mentioned this to the detective during one of my follow-up calls. She sounded distracted, papers rustling in the background. She asked if I was certain it was the same man. I wasn't, not entirely. People wear brown jackets, people walk past buildings, people talk on phones, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. She took down the information and promised to look into it. I never heard back. The woman with the raspy laugh was easier to track down. She worked at a vintage clothing store several blocks away, surrounded by musty fabrics and the lingering scent of old perfume. When I approached her, pretending to browse through a rack of worn leather jackets, she recognized me immediately. "You're from her building," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice carried that same rough quality I remembered from late-night conversations drifting through the walls. The police already talked to me. I nodded, running my fingers along the sleeve of a jacket that felt too soft, like it had been worn by someone who no longer needed it. "I was just wondering if she had mentioned anything to you, about feeling unsafe maybe, or planning to go somewhere." The woman's laugh held no humor. She was always worried about something. That's just who she was. Jumped at shadows, you know. But the last time I saw her, she seemed different, calmer maybe, like she'd made a decision about something. "What kind of decision?" She didn't say, but she gave me this. The woman reached behind the counter and pulled out a small silver bracelet, tarnished with age. Said she wanted me to have it in case something happened. I thought she was being dramatic, but now. I stared at the bracelet, recognizing it. She had worn it every day, a nervous habit of turning it around her wrist when she was thinking. The fact that she had given it away suggested she knew she wouldn't be coming back. "Did you tell the police about this?" The woman's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "I told them we were friends. I told them she sometimes worried about things. I didn't mention the bracelet." "Why not?" "Because she asked me not to. Said if anything ever happened to her, I should wait before talking about it. Said the timing would matter." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the store's inadequate heating. "How long were you supposed to wait?" She didn't say exactly, just said I'd know when it was right. I left the store with more questions than answers and a growing certainty that her disappearance hadn't been random. Someone had been planning something, either her or someone else. The bracelet felt like a message, but I couldn't decode its meaning. Back in my apartment, I could hear every sound from the empty space next door with new clarity. The buildings settling, the pipes groaning, the occasional footstep from the tenant above. But sometimes, late at night, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound like furniture being moved. It always lasted just long enough to make me question whether I'd imagined it. The superintendent was a man in his 60s who had worked in the building longer than anyone could remember. His keys jangled when he walked, and he had a habit of humming old songs under his breath. When I asked him about the sounds, he looked at me with the patient expression of someone accustomed to tenant complaints. "Old building," he said, "pipes expand, wood shifts. These walls are thin. You're probably hearing something from another apartment." But I knew the sounds of my neighbors. The family upstairs had a predictable routine. The couple below argued about money every few days, but otherwise kept quiet. These scraping sounds came from her apartment, I was certain. "Has anyone been in there since the police finished?" His expression became more careful. "Just me, checking on things, making sure the pipes don't freeze, that sort of thing." "Have you noticed anything unusual?" "Like what?" "I don't know, things moved around maybe. Signs that someone else has been inside." He was quiet for a long moment, keys jingling softly as he shifted them from hand to hand. "You know, now that you mention it, I did notice something strange the last time I was in there. Her bookshelf looked different, books arranged differently than I remembered, but I figured maybe the police had moved things around during their search." That night I lay awake listening. The scraping sound came again, faint but unmistakable. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I pressed my ear to the wall, but heard nothing more. The next morning I called the detective. She sounded even more tired than before, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice when I described what I'd been hearing. "Buildings make noise," she said, "especially old ones, and grief can make us hear things that aren't there." I'm not grieving, I barely knew her. Sometimes that makes it worse. We feel guilty for not paying more attention when we had the chance. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was projecting my own guilt onto random sounds and coincidental sightings. But that night, I decided to find out for certain. I waited until the building was quiet, then slipped into the hallway. The superintendent had given the police a key, but I knew he kept a spare in his office. It took me 20 minutes to find it, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the entire building could hear it. Her apartment felt different in the darkness, colder somehow, and the air seemed thicker. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate, keeping the beam low to avoid attracting attention from the street. The bookshelf was exactly as the superintendent had described. The books were arranged by height rather than subject, which seemed wrong for someone who had been studying literature. Her desk drawers were empty, but when I ran my fingers along the bottom of the deepest one, I felt something taped underneath. It was a small key, the kind used for safety deposit boxes or lockers. No identifying marks, no attached tag, just a key that someone had thought important enough to hide. I was examining it when I heard the scraping sound again, much louder now that I was inside the apartment. It was coming from the bedroom. My mouth went dry. I stood frozen in the living room, listening as the sound continued. Not random settling or pipe expansion, deliberate movement, rhythmic and purposeful. I forced myself to move toward the bedroom, each step feeling like it might be my last. The door was partially open, and I could see the outline of the bed, the dresser, the window with its drawn curtains. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Nothing. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as it had during my previous visit, except for one detail. The window was open, just a crack, but enough to let in cold air and the distant sounds of traffic. I was certain it had been closed before. I approached the window carefully, looking for signs of disturbance. The curtains moved slightly in the breeze, and I noticed something I had missed before. Scratches on the windowsill, as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. That's when I realized what the scraping sound had been. Someone had been climbing in and out of this window. Someone who had a reason to return to this apartment after she disappeared. I closed the window and left quickly, locking the door behind me and returning the key to the superintendent's office. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever had been using that window knew I had discovered their secret. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and second-guessing. I found myself checking the locks on my own windows, drawing the curtains tighter, jumping at sounds that had never bothered me before. The hidden key felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. I knew I should turn it over to the police, but something held me back. Maybe it was the detective's dismissive tone, or maybe it was a growing suspicion that the official investigation had missed something crucial. Either way, I decided to follow this lead myself. The key fit perfectly into a locker at the central bus station. Inside, I found a manila envelope containing photographs, documents, and a letter written in her careful handwriting. The photographs showed the brown jacket man in various locations around our neighborhood. Not casual snapshots, but surveillance photos taken with a telephoto lens. The man entering and leaving buildings, talking to different people, always looking over his shoulder as though he knew he was being watched. The documents were copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, and what looked like private investigator notes, all related to a series of disappearances in our area over the past 5 years. Women living alone, no signs of struggle, no clear motive, cases that had gone cold after a few weeks of investigation. Her letter was dated the day before she disappeared. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've been investigating a pattern that the police either can't see or don't want to acknowledge. The man in the brown jacket isn't just someone who visited me occasionally. He's been watching all of us, learning our routines, waiting for the right opportunity. My hands shook as I continued reading. I have evidence that he's connected to at least 3 other disappearances, but I can't prove it yet. He's careful, patient, and he knows how to avoid leaving traces. I think he's been using empty apartments as staging areas, places where he can plan and prepare without being noticed. The letter went on to describe how she had been documenting his movements, trying to establish a pattern. She had discovered that he had access to several buildings in the area, possibly through connections with landlords or maintenance companies. He would identify women who lived alone, study their habits, then wait for the perfect moment to act. I know this sounds paranoid, but I've seen him watching other women the same way he watched me. There's a woman 2 blocks over who matches his preferred type. Young, quiet, keeps to herself. I've seen him near her building 3 times in the past week. The letter ended with an address and a plea. If something happens to me, please make sure she's safe, and please don't let him get away with this again. I stared at the address, recognizing the street. It was close enough to walk to in a neighborhood similar to ours. Old buildings, thin walls, residents who minded their own business. The rational thing would have been to take everything to the police immediately, but I found myself walking toward that address instead, driven by a mixture of curiosity and responsibility. She had trusted someone to find this evidence, to act on it. By accident or design, that someone was me. The building was nearly identical to ours, down to the worn brick facade and the narrow entrance. I stood across the street, watching windows and doorways, looking for any sign of the brown jacket man. I didn't have to wait long. He emerged from an alley beside the building, moving with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. Same posture, same careful way of scanning the street before committing to a direction. He walked past me without a glance, but I caught a whiff of his cologne, sharp and medicinal. I followed him at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs. He led me through several blocks of increasingly familiar territory, past the coffee shop where I'd seen him before, past the vintage clothing store, finally stopping at a small office building with a sign advertising property management services. He used his own key to enter. I waited across the street, watching the windows light up on the 2nd floor. After about an hour, he emerged carrying a briefcase and what looked like a set of keys. Different keys, I realized. Keys to different buildings, different apartments, different lives he could disrupt. That's when I understood the full scope of what she had discovered. He wasn't just a predator who struck randomly. He was someone with legitimate access to multiple buildings, someone who could enter apartments legally, study potential victims, and plan his attacks with minimal risk of discovery. I followed him to 2 more buildings that evening, watching as he let himself in with apparent authority. At each location, he spent exactly the same amount of time inside, long enough to check on something, short enough to avoid attracting attention. The pattern was becoming clear, but I still didn't understand the end game. What was he doing in those apartments? Where were the women he had targeted? The answer came 3 days later, in the form of a news report about construction workers discovering human remains in the basement of a demolished building across town. The reporter mentioned that police were investigating possible connections to several missing person cases. I called the detective immediately, but she was out of the office. I left a message describing everything I had found, but I knew it might be too late for some of his victims. That night I heard the scraping sound again from her apartment. This time I was ready. I had borrowed a camera from a friend, one with night vision capability. I positioned myself in my own bedroom with a clear view of her fire escape through my window. Then I waited. He appeared just after midnight, climbing up from the alley with practiced ease. The brown jacket was gone, replaced by dark clothing that helped him blend into the shadows. He moved quickly but quietly, jimmying her window open with tools that suggested this wasn't his first break-in. I filmed everything, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. He was inside for nearly an hour, and I could see the beam of his flashlight moving methodically through the rooms. When he finally emerged, he was carrying something, a small bag or box that he handled carefully as though its contents were fragile. He climbed down the fire escape and disappeared into the alley. I waited until I was certain he was gone, then called 911. The police arrived within minutes, but by then he was long gone. The detective showed up shortly after, looking skeptical until I showed her the video footage and the contents of the locker. "Why didn't you bring this to us immediately?" she asked, but her tone had changed. She was taking me seriously now. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me, and I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to make it stick." She studied the photographs and documents, her expression growing darker with each page. "Some of these reports are from other jurisdictions. If he's been operating across multiple areas, that would explain why we didn't see the pattern." The investigation that followed moved quickly. The property management company confirmed that he had been an employee for 6 years, with access to dozens of buildings. A search of his apartment revealed detailed files on potential victims, including floor plans, daily schedules, and personal information gathered through illegal entries. They found her belongings in a storage unit he rented under a false name. Her purse, her identification, personal items from other missing women, but they didn't find her. He was arrested at his office the next morning, maintaining his innocence even when confronted with the evidence. During questioning, he admitted to entering apartments illegally, but claimed he was only stealing small items, nothing more serious. The detective called me after the first interrogation session. He's not talking about the disappearances, claims he doesn't know anything about missing women, says he was just a petty thief who got carried away. Do you believe him? No, but believing and proving are different things. We need more evidence to connect him to the actual disappearances. That evidence came from an unexpected source. The woman with the raspy laugh called me a week after his arrest, her voice shaking with emotion. "I lied to you before," she said, "about the bracelet, about what she told me. I was scared, but I can't stay quiet anymore." We met at the vintage clothing store after closing time. She locked the door behind me and led me to a back room filled with boxes and mannequins. "She didn't just give me the bracelet," she began. "She gave me a message, said if anything happened to her, I should wait until someone was arrested, then tell the truth." She pulled out a small recording device, the kind used for voice memos. She made this the night before she disappeared, said it was insurance in case her evidence wasn't enough. The recording was brief but devastating, her voice calm and clear, describing how the brown jacket man had approached her directly, not as a predator, but as someone offering to help her disappear. "He knows about my debts," her recorded voice explained. "Knows I've been struggling, that I'm behind on rent. He says he can help me start over somewhere else, but I have to leave everything behind, make it look like I just vanished." The recording continued with her growing realization that his offer wasn't legitimate, that the other women who had accepted similar deals had never been heard from again. "I'm going to meet him tomorrow night. I'll be wearing a wire, trying to get him to admit what happened to the others. If something goes wrong, if I don't come back, this recording should be enough to start a real investigation." But she had never made it to that meeting. Something had gone wrong before she could gather the final evidence she needed. The recording was enough to reopen the investigation with renewed focus. Faced with her voice describing his approach, the brown jacket man finally began to talk. His confession was methodical and chilling. He had been targeting women in financial distress, offering them a way out of their problems in exchange for their cooperation in faking their own disappearances. He would help them leave town, he claimed, set them up with new identities in different places. Instead, he had been killing them and disposing of their bodies in buildings scheduled for demolition. The construction site where remains had been found was just one of several locations he had used over the years. She had been different from the others. Instead of accepting his offer, she had recognized the danger and started investigating. Her surveillance photos and documentation had threatened to expose his entire operation. "She was supposed to meet me that night," he told the detective, "but she never showed up. I went to her apartment to find out why, and she was gone, just gone. I thought maybe she had figured it out and run." "So you kept going back to her apartment, looking for what?" "Evidence. I knew she had been watching me, taking pictures. I needed to find out what she had collected, who she might have told." But he never found her evidence because she had been smarter than he realized. She had hidden it where only someone who cared enough to investigate would think to look. The case made headlines for weeks. The brown jacket man was charged with multiple counts of murder, and police departments across several jurisdictions began reviewing their cold cases for similar patterns. But one question remained unanswered. If he hadn't killed her that night, what had happened to her? The answer came in a phone call I received 3 months after his arrest. A woman's voice, familiar but older somehow, tired in a way that spoke of long sleepless nights and constant vigilance. "I heard about the arrest," she said. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up." It was her, alive, hiding, waiting for the moment when it would be safe to resurface. "I knew he was getting close," she explained. "The night I was supposed to meet him, I realized it was a trap. so I disappeared on my own terms, using the same techniques I'd learned from watching him. She had been living under a false identity, working odd jobs, staying in places where questions weren't asked, waiting for someone to find the evidence she'd left behind, waiting for justice to catch up with the man who had terrorized so many women. Why didn't you go to the police yourself? Because I wasn't sure who to trust. He had connections, access to information that suggested he might have help. I needed to be certain he was really stopped before I could risk coming forward. We met the following week in a small diner far from our old neighborhood. She looked different, thinner, and more cautious, but undeniably alive. The detective was there too, along with a prosecutor who needed her testimony to ensure the brown jacket man would never hurt anyone again. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Her testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a first-hand account of his methods and the fear he had instilled in his victims. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that his systematic targeting of vulnerable women represented a particularly heinous form of predation, one that had destroyed families and terrorized entire communities. After the trial, she and I kept in touch sporadically. She moved to a different part of the country, started over with a new name and a new life. Sometimes she sent postcards with no return address, just a few words to let me know she was okay. I moved out of our old building eventually. Too many memories, too many nights spent listening for sounds that would never come again. But I kept the recording device she had used, and sometimes I played back her voice from that final message. "If you're hearing this," she had said, "then something has gone wrong, but don't let that stop you from looking for the truth. Someone needs to speak for the women who can't speak for themselves." The brown jacket man died in prison 2 years after his conviction, killed by another inmate who had learned about his crimes. The detective called to tell me, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and regret. "Justice," she said, "not the kind we prefer, but justice nonetheless." I agreed, but part of me wondered if true justice was possible in cases like these. How do you balance the scales when so many lives have been lost, so many families destroyed? The answer, I think, lies in the details we choose to remember and the stories we choose to tell. In the courage of a woman who risked everything to protect strangers she had never met, in the persistence of investigators who refused to let cases go cold, in the willingness of ordinary people to pay attention when something feels wrong. The grandfather clock in my old building still ticks irregularly, I'm told. New tenants notice it just as I did. But now I think that broken rhythm serves a purpose, reminding us to listen more carefully to the sounds around us, to trust our instincts when they tell us something isn't right. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than someone who cares enough to investigate when the world seems slightly off balance, when the familiar becomes strange, when the silence holds secrets that demand to be heard. Story 8. The morning air carried the sweet scent of dew, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly tilled earth wafting through the open window. Sunlight streamed into the room, dappling the floor with a kaleidoscope of warm hues. A gentle rustling from the curtains was the only sound, barely audible over the ticking of an old wall clock. But my eyes kept drifting to the half-open door across the room, its hinges swaying ever so slightly as if pushed by an invisible hand. A quiet unease settled over the scene, a lurking presence in the bright morning light, hinting at a story yet to be told. I've been watching that door for 3 hours now, or maybe it's been watching me. The coffee grew cold in my hand sometime before dawn. I remember making it, remember the ritual of measuring grounds, the familiar hiss of water meeting heat, but I don't remember drinking any. The mug sits heavy against my palms, a ceramic anchor in a room that seems to shift when I'm not looking directly at it. She always said I noticed things others missed, small things, the way people's voices changed when they lied, how shadows fell differently in rooms where bad things had happened. I used to think it was a gift. The floorboards creak in the hallway, not the settling sounds old houses make. I know those intimately now. This is different, deliberate, someone walking carefully, trying not to be heard. I found the first letter under my morning paper. Cream-colored envelope, my name written in careful block letters, no return address. Inside, a single line, you were there that night, nothing more. I kept it in my jacket pocket for weeks, the paper growing soft from handling. The door moves again, just a fraction, but enough to let in a slice of the dark hallway beyond. I should get up. I should close it properly or open it wide, end this strange dance between revelation and concealment. Instead, I sit frozen, coffee cooling, watching. Memory is unreliable. I learned this in therapy back when I still believed talking could fix things. The mind reshapes events, fills gaps with imagination, turns shadows into monsters or monsters into shadows. But some details remain sharp as broken glass. The sound her shoes made on gravel, the way moonlight caught the chrome bumper of that car, how quiet everything became after. The second letter arrived on a Tuesday. I'm certain because Tuesday is garbage day, and I was wheeling the bin back when I saw it tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. Same handwriting, same careful block letters. The others don't remember, but you do. Others, plural, this suggested a group, a conspiracy of forgetting, but I couldn't recall any others. Just me, standing at the edge of understanding, holding pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. The room grows warmer as morning progresses, but the chill in my chest remains constant. It settled there the night I first saw her face in the local paper. Missing person. Reward offered. Have you seen this woman? The photograph was grainy, taken at some family gathering where she was laughing at something beyond the camera's range, but I knew those eyes. I called the number, hung up before anyone answered, called again. This time a man's voice, tired and hopeful. Hello, do you have information about my daughter? Your daughter, 2 words that changed everything. Because she wasn't just a face in a crowd anymore, wasn't just a stranger whose path had crossed mine in some half-remembered moment. She belonged to someone. Someone who waited by the phone, who put her picture on milk cartons and telephone poles, who probably lay awake staring at ceilings and wondering. The third letter came with a photograph. I'm looking at it now, propped against the windowsill where the morning light makes every detail painfully clear. It's taken from a distance through trees, but the subjects are unmistakable. A man and woman standing beside a car, their faces turned toward each other in conversation. The woman is pointing at something beyond the frame. The man has his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. The man is me. I don't remember this conversation, don't remember that particular car, though it looks familiar in the way dreams feel familiar upon waking. But there I am, captured in someone else's memory, participating in a scene I can't place. The woman in the photograph isn't the same woman from the missing person flyer. This one is older, wearing a dark coat that makes her blend into the evening shadows. Her face is turned away from the camera, but something about her posture suggests urgency or fear. The door swings wider now, revealing more of the hallway's darkness. I can see the opposite wall, where family photographs hang in neat rows, smiling faces from better times when the future seemed manageable and the past stayed where it belonged. I've been thinking about that night again, the one the letters reference, the one that sits in my memory like a stone in still water, creating ripples I can't quite trace to their source. I was driving home from somewhere, a work function, maybe, or dinner with friends whose names have faded. The roads were empty, slick with recent rain. That's when I saw the car. It was pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in the darkness like a distress signal. I slowed down, the way you do when you're trying to decide whether to stop and help or mind your own business and keep driving. The decision felt important then, though I couldn't say why. A woman stood beside the open driver's door, her silhouette illuminated by the interior light. She was looking at something in her hands, keys, maybe, or a phone. When my headlights swept across her, she looked up, and for just a moment our eyes met through the windshield. I kept driving. This is what haunts me now, sitting in this bright morning room with its deceptive normalcy. Not what I did, but what I didn't do. The choice to keep moving, to let someone else be the good Samaritan, to arrive home safely with my conscience only slightly bruised. But memory is unreliable, and maybe that's not how it happened at all. The fourth letter contained an address, not mine, somewhere across town, in a neighborhood I rarely visit. Below the address, a time, and below that, you owe her this much. I drove there, of course. Curiosity is stronger than fear, at least initially. The address belonged to a small house with a neat front yard and curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. I parked across the street and waited, though I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. A man emerged after an hour, middle-aged, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested a blue-collar job and careful budgeting. He walked to the mailbox, checked its contents, then stood for a moment looking up and down the street. His gaze lingered on my car long enough to make me uncomfortable. When he went back inside, I saw a curtain twitch in the front window. Someone else was watching, too. The coffee has gone completely cold now. I set the mug on the side table, next to the stack of letters I've read and reread until the words have lost all meaning. 5 letters total, each one drawing me deeper into a story I'm not sure I want to understand. The 5th letter was different, longer, more detailed, written in the same careful block letters, but with an urgency that made the pen press deeper into the paper. She never made it home that night. The car was found the next morning empty, keys still in the ignition. The police said she probably got confused, wandered into the woods looking for help. They searched for weeks, found nothing. Case went cold, but you saw her. You were the last person to see her alive, and you just drove away. The last person to see her alive. These words circle in my mind like vultures, picking at the edges of certainty, because I'm not sure anymore what I saw that night, or when that night even was. Time has a way of folding in on itself, making recent events feel ancient and old memories sharp as yesterday's pain. The door is fully open now. I can see the entire hallway, empty and waiting. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaks. The sound of someone trying to move quietly, or maybe just the natural settling of old wood under changing temperature. I think about the man at the mailbox, how he looked at my car with recognition rather than curiosity. I think about the curtain moving in the window, about being watched by watchers, about the possibility that I'm not the only one receiving letters. The photograph on the windowsill catches the light differently now. The angle of the sun has shifted, and I can see details that were hidden before. In the background, barely visible through the trees, there's another car. Dark-colored, nondescript, but definitely occupied. A shadow behind the windshield suggests someone sitting in the driver's seat. Someone else was watching that night, too. This changes things, though I'm not sure how. If there were other witnesses, other people who saw whatever happened between me and the woman by the roadside, then why haven't they come forward? Why am I the only one receiving these accusations wrapped in cream-colored envelopes? Unless I'm not. The house feels different now, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. Every sound seems amplified: the tick of the clock, the whisper of curtains against the window frame, the almost inaudible hum of electricity through the walls. I'm hyper-aware of my own breathing, of the way my heart has begun to beat slightly faster. I stand up finally, legs stiff from sitting in one position for too long. The movement feels significant, like crossing a threshold I can't uncross. The letters remain on the side table, but their hold on me has shifted. They're no longer accusations, but invitations, breadcrumbs leading deeper into the forest. The hallway stretches before me, longer than it seemed from the chair. Family photographs line the walls like witnesses, their smiling faces now appearing forced, their eyes tracking my movement with uncomfortable intensity. At the far end, the front door stands closed, but I can see light seeping around its edges. Someone is on the porch. Not walking by, not delivering mail or packages, standing still, waiting. The shadow visible through the frosted glass panel hasn't moved in the minutes I've been watching. It's patient in a way that suggests purpose, familiarity with waiting. I approach slowly, each step deliberate. The floorboards that creaked under mysterious footsteps earlier are silent under mine, as if the house itself is holding its breath. When I reach the door, I can hear something new, the soft sound of breathing that isn't my own. My hand hovers over the deadbolt, such a small action, turning a piece of metal, opening a door, but it feels enormous. Final. Like choosing between two different versions of reality, two different endings to a story I'm still not sure I understand. The breathing continues, steady and patient, not threatening exactly, but not reassuring either, just human, which somehow makes it worse. Monsters would be easier to dismiss. I turn the lock. The door swings open to reveal the woman from the photograph. Not the missing woman, not the one whose father waits by the phone, but the other one. The one in the dark coat, the one whose face was turned away from the camera. She's older than I expected, with gray threading through dark hair and lines around eyes that have seen too much. You remember now, she says, and it's not a question. But I don't remember. That's the terrible truth sitting in my chest like a weight. I don't remember her, don't remember that conversation captured in the photograph, don't remember anything beyond the woman by the roadside and the choice to keep driving. I think there's been a mistake, I begin, but she's already shaking her head. No mistake, you were there, we both were, the difference is I stopped. The words hang between us, heavy with implication. She stopped. Did what I didn't do, made the choice I avoided, and somehow that choice led here to this moment, to letters and photographs and accusations that feel both foreign and familiar. What happened to her, I ask, though I'm not sure I want to know. That's what we need to figure out, she says, stepping past me into the house. Together. The door remains open behind her, morning light spilling across the threshold, but the brightness feels different now, less welcoming, more exposing, as if everything hidden is about to be dragged into the light, examined, judged. She moves through my house like she's been here before, settling into the chair I vacated, picking up the letters with familiar ease. "You kept them all," she observes. "Good, we'll need them." "Away. You and I, the ones who were there, the ones who remember, even when we try not to." But I don't remember, and I tell her this. She looks at me with something that might be pity or might be understanding, two emotions that feel equally uncomfortable. "Memory is funny," she says, echoing my earlier thoughts. "Sometimes it protects us from things we're not ready to know, but ready or not, the truth has a way of surfacing." She holds up the photograph, the one that shows us together in conversation. "This was taken 3 days after she disappeared. We met at the place where her car was found. You wanted to help search, said you felt responsible somehow. We talked for hours." The conversation she describes feels like something that happened to someone else, in some parallel version of my life where I made different choices. But looking at the photograph, at the body language that suggests familiarity, intimacy even, I can almost feel the echo of those lost hours. Why don't I remember? Trauma, she says simply, guilt, the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable knowledge, but the letters were meant to bring it back gradually, piece by piece. Well, you sent them. We sent them to each other. It was your idea, actually. A way to hold ourselves accountable, to make sure we didn't forget again. The room tilts slightly, reality reshaping itself around this new information. I sent letters to myself, accusations wrapped in cream-colored envelopes, breadcrumbs leading back to a truth I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten the burial. What truth, I ask, though part of me already knows. She sets down the photograph, looks at me with eyes that hold too much knowledge, that we found her. That night after you came back, after we searched together, we found her in the woods and she was still alive. Still alive, two words that change everything, that transform a story of abandonment into something far more complex. I lean against the door frame, legs suddenly unsteady, as fragments of memory begin to surface like debris from a shipwreck. A woman's voice, weak but determined, calling for help from the darkness between trees. The beam of a flashlight illuminating a face pale with shock and cold. The decision we made together, standing over her broken body, about what came next. She asked us not to call for help, the woman continues, her voice barely above a whisper. Said there were people looking for her, people who would hurt her if they found her alive, begged us to help her disappear instead. The memory crystallizes slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. I remember now, the fear in her eyes, the way she gripped my hand when I knelt beside her, the impossible choice she laid at our feet. So we did, I whisper. We helped her disappear. We did what she asked, got her to a hospital in the next state, helped her create a new identity, gave her the chance to start over somewhere safe. But the guilt of letting her family think she was dead, of letting them grieve and wonder and hope, that was harder to live with than we expected. The letters make sense now, not accusations but reminders, ways of keeping the secret and the guilt alive, of ensuring we never forgot the weight of our choice. Because forgetting would mean her sacrifice was meaningless, her family's pain was for nothing. Is she safe? I ask. As far as we know, she sends a card every year on the anniversary. Nothing identifying, just a picture of wherever she's living now. Mountains, usually, or small towns where nobody asks too many questions. The door still stands open, morning light streaming across the threshold, but the brightness no longer feels exposing. Instead, it feels like possibility, like the chance to step out of the shadows of half-remembered guilt and into something approaching peace. The family, I say, her father. Still waiting, still hoping, that's the price of our choice, their uncertainty. We saved her life, but couldn't save them from the not knowing. It's an imperfect solution, a moral compromise that satisfies no one completely. But looking at the woman in my chair, at the letters that brought us back together, at the photograph that captured a moment of shared responsibility, I think maybe imperfect solutions are all we get sometimes. The clock on the wall continues its steady ticking, marking time that moves forward regardless of our choices, our guilt, our attempts to reshape the past into something more bearable. Outside, the world continues its daily business, unaware of the story that has just reassembled itself in this bright morning room. "What now?" I ask. She stands, smoothing down her dark coat, preparing to leave. Now we remember. We carry it together instead of alone, and we wait for next year's card. She pauses at the threshold, looking back at me with something that might be forgiveness or might be understanding. The guilt never goes away completely, but neither does the knowledge that we saved a life. Sometimes that has to be enough. After she leaves, I close the door and return to my chair. The letters remain on the side table, but they look different now, not accusations, but artifacts of a story more complex than I'd imagined. Outside, the morning continues its gentle progression toward afternoon, light shifting across the floor in familiar patterns. But something has changed. The half-open door that started this day no longer swings on uncertain hinges. It stands firmly closed now, keeping in what needs to be kept in, keeping out what needs to be kept out. And in the distance, so faint I might be imagining it, I hear the sound of a car starting, driving away, carrying its own secrets into the bright uncertainty of another day. Story 9. Door clicked shut behind me, leaving the air unusually still. My skin prickled as though the room itself was holding its breath. The faint aroma of burnt coffee lingered, a scent that should have been comforting but instead felt misplaced. I brushed my fingers over the rough fabric of the armchair, noting how it seemed to resist my touch. A creak sounded from above, soft and uncertain, like a whispered confession. It was then I realized the silence wasn't just around me, it was pressing in, waiting. The photograph lay face down on the kitchen table. I remember thinking how deliberate that seemed, how careful. When I turned it over, the woman's smile felt wrong somehow, too wide for her eyes. She wore a blue dress with tiny flowers. I counted them once 17 across the collar. Why I counted them, I couldn't say. I should mention the neighbor. She appeared at my fence that morning, pruning shears in hand, though her roses had been trimmed weeks ago. Her mouth moved constantly, forming words I couldn't quite catch through the glass. She kept pointing toward the upstairs window, the one that stays locked. The coffee cup sat half empty on the counter for days. I watched the cream separate, forming patterns that reminded me of maps, coastlines of places I'd never been. The rim bore lipstick marks, a shade I don't own, pink like the inside of shells or fresh wounds. There's something about the way light falls through that particular window. It cuts the room into sections, creating shadows where none should exist. I found myself standing there often, watching dust motes drift like tiny secrets. The floorboards beneath my feet felt hollow, as though the house were built on emptiness. The woman in the photograph, I began to notice her everywhere. Not her face exactly, but the way she held her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head. I saw it in reflections, in the periphery of my vision. In the grocery store, a stranger turned, and for a moment the resemblance made my breath catch. I started keeping notes, small observations that seemed important at the time. The way the mail carrier lingered at my box, how the streetlight outside flickered in patterns of three, the sound of footsteps on gravel, always just after midnight, always stopping at my gate. The basement door was painted green once. I can see traces of it beneath the white, like bruises showing through makeup. The key hangs on a hook by the kitchen sink, though I don't remember placing it there. Its weight feels significant in my palm, heavier than such a small thing should be. She used to hum while she worked. I remember that now, though I'm not sure when the memory surfaced. A tuneless melody that drifted through the house like smoke. I catch myself humming it sometimes, the notes familiar on my tongue, though I can't name the song. The neighbor stopped coming to her garden. Her roses grew wild, thorns catching at the chain-link fence between our yards. I watched them bloom and die from my kitchen window, counting petals as they fell. Red like wine spilled on white cloth, red like other things I try not to think about. I found the second photograph tucked inside a book I'd never read. Same woman, different dress, green this time with buttons like small pearls. She stood beside a man whose face had been carefully cut away, leaving only his shadow on the wall behind her. The scissors lay on the table where I'd left them, though I couldn't recall using them. The phone rings at strange hours. When I answer, there's only breathing, soft and measured. Sometimes I think I hear my name whispered in the static, but voices can play tricks in the dark. I've stopped answering, but the ringing continues, echoing through rooms I thought were empty. There's a stain on the carpet upstairs, shaped like a question mark. I've scrubbed it countless times, but it always returns, dark and insistent. The cleaning supplies burn my hands now, leaving marks that fade by morning. I wonder if guilt leaves similar traces, invisible but permanent. The woman's smile haunts me less than her eyes. They hold a knowledge I don't want to share, a secret that tastes like copper pennies and regret. I've hidden the photographs, but her gaze finds me anyway, reflected in windows, in puddles, in the blade of the kitchen knife I used to cut my evening fruit. I remember now why the coffee smelled wrong. She drank it black, bitter as medicine. I always added cream, watching it swirl and disappear. But that morning the cup held only darkness, and I knew she wouldn't be coming back to finish it. The neighbor asked me once about the woman who used to visit, asked in that careful way people do when they're not sure they want the answer. I told her I lived alone, had always lived alone. But her eyes lingered on the upstairs window, the one that stays locked, and I wondered what she'd seen there in the early morning light. The floorboards creak differently now, as though the house is settling into new rhythms. I follow the sounds sometimes, tracking them from room to room, but I never find their source. Only empty spaces and the lingering scent of flowers, the kind they place on graves. I should have noticed the patterns sooner, the way she arranged things in perfect lines, salt and pepper shakers, books on the shelf, even her shoes by the door, toes pointing toward the exit as though she were always planning to leave. Now I arrange things the same way, though I can't remember learning how. The key to the basement grows warm in my hand. I hold it often, feeling its teeth bite into my palm. Behind that green-painted door lies an answer I'm not ready to find, but answers have a way of surfacing like bodies in still water, no matter how deep you think you've buried them. The last photograph shows only her hands, pale against dark fabric. Her wedding ring catches the light, a band of gold I never saw her wear. In the background, barely visible, stands a shovel leaning against a wall. Its blade is clean, but dirt clings to the handle like dried tears. I understand now why the silence feels so heavy. It's not empty, it's full of words that will never be spoken, songs that will never be finished, footsteps that have found their final rest. The house holds its breath because breathing would disturb what lies beneath. The neighbors' roses have grown through the fence, their thorns catching at my clothes when I pass. Red petals scatter across my yard like drops of something precious spilled. I gather them sometimes, pressing them between pages of books I'll never read again. Evidence of beauty in a world that feels increasingly hollow. But tonight, as I sit in the armchair with its rough fabric and resistant texture, I hear something new. Not footsteps or whispered names, but the soft sound of earth settling. The basement key grows cold in my hand, and I realize the waiting is almost over. The photograph on the table has turned itself face down again, though I left it upright this morning. When I reach to flip it over, my fingers hesitate. Some images once seen can never be unseen. Some smiles carry too much weight. Above me, that familiar creak sounds once more, soft and uncertain as a confession. But this time, I think I know what it's trying to tell me. Story 10. My eyes locked onto the pendulum of the grandfather clock, which had been swinging rhythmically for as long as I could remember. But now, for a heartbeat, it paused mid-swing as if hesitating. The room was steeped in silence, each tick of the clock a distant echo that failed to reach my ears. The heavy curtains barely moved, although I could feel a draft brushing past my skin. I waited, eyes tracing the shadows cast along the floor, searching for that unsettling shift, a motion I knew should not be. Just as my breath turned shallow, a gentle thud resonated from behind the wall, a sound that had no place in the stillness. The sound pulls me back, always back to that house, to those walls that seemed to breathe with secrets. I press my palm against the cool surface now, feeling for vibrations that might explain what I heard then, what I think I heard. The detective's voice comes to me in fragments, like radio static clearing momentarily before dissolving again. When did you first notice something was wrong? But wrong implies a right, doesn't it? And I'm no longer certain there ever was a right in that place. I remember the wallpaper, faded roses on cream background, edges curling where the humidity had worked its way beneath. The pattern seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, the flowers rearranging themselves into faces, into expressions I couldn't quite read. The homeowner had mentioned the wallpaper during our first conversation, how it had been there since before the previous tenant, before the one before that. Family heirloom, she'd said, running her fingers along the wall with something that might have been affection or might have been resignation. Some things you just don't change. But the thud, that sound that didn't belong. I find myself returning to it, circling like water around a drain. Was it the settling of old wood, the expansion and contraction of pipes hidden behind plaster and paint? Or was it something else, something that required explanation in ways that settling and expansion could not provide? The case file sits on my desk now, though I'm not sure why I still keep it. The official conclusion was straightforward enough. No evidence of foul play, no signs of forced entry. No indication that anything untoward had occurred within those walls. But the file doesn't capture the weight of that silence, the way it pressed against my eardrums like deep water. She had been missing for 3 days when they called me in. The neighbor who reported it seemed genuinely concerned, though there was something in her manner that suggested she'd been watching that house for longer than 3 days. Much longer. She kept regular hours, the neighbor told me, standing in her own doorway, reluctant to step outside. Lights on at sunset, off by 10, always the same pattern until they weren't. Pattern, everything about that case was about patterns, about the subtle disruptions that signal when something has shifted out of its natural rhythm. The grandfather clock was part of that pattern, its pendulum marking time in a house where time seemed to have become negotiable. I walked through those rooms methodically, professionally. Kitchen clean, dishes put away, bedroom neat, bed made with hospital corners, living room arranged with the kind of precision that speaks to solitary living, to a life organized around the absence of others rather than their presence, everything in its place. Except for the sound. It came again while I was examining the bookshelf, running my finger along the spines of novels arranged alphabetically by author. The same gentle thud, muffled but distinct, emanating from somewhere behind the wall that separated the living room from what the floor plan indicated was a storage closet. I found the closet door, though it took longer than it should have. The hallway seemed to bend in ways that didn't match my memory of the house's layout, and I wondered if the stress of the case was affecting my perception more than I'd realized. The door was locked, but the key hung from a small hook nearby, as if its concealment was more symbolic than practical. Inside, winter coats, boxes of photographs, the accumulated detritus of a life lived in one place for many years. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the sound, but the wall at the back of the closet felt different when I pressed against it. Not hollow exactly, but less solid than I expected. The photographs drew my attention, box after box of them, some in albums, others loose and fading. The missing woman appeared in many of them, but always at the edges, always slightly out of focus, as if she existed in the peripheral vision of her own life. In the center of most photos was another woman, similar in age and build, but with a presence that commanded the frame. Her sister, the neighbor explained when I asked. They lived together for years until the accident. Accident, another word that carries weight without specificity. I pressed for details, but the neighbor's knowledge was second-hand, gathered from overheard conversations and observed behaviors rather than direct experience. The sister had died, that much was certain. How and when remained frustratingly vague. The thud came again as I was leaving the closet. This time I was ready for it, listening with the kind of focused attention that sharpens all the senses. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, irregular but intentional, like someone tapping out a message in a code I didn't understand. I spent the next hour mapping the walls, measuring distances, trying to account for every inch of space within the house's footprint. The mathematics didn't align. There was a gap, a space that existed according to the building's exterior dimensions, but couldn't be accessed from any room I'd found. The contractor I consulted later was dismissive. Old houses settle funny, he told me. Walls get added, removed, modified. You'd be surprised how many places have dead space nobody thinks about anymore. Dead space, the phrase stayed with me. I returned to the house the next day and the day after that. Each visit revealed new details that I'd somehow missed before. A second key hidden behind the kitchen clock, a loose floorboard in the hallway that creaked with a different pitch than the others, a window in the bathroom that offered a view of the backyard I hadn't noticed previously. But it was the diary that changed everything. I found it wedged between the mattress and box spring, wrapped in a pillowcase that had yellowed with age. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind that comes from years of practice. But the entries were troubling in their repetition, their obsessive attention to details that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. She's in the walls again, read one entry. I can hear her moving around, trying to find her way out. I've told her there's no door from that side, but she doesn't listen. She never listened. Another, the sound is getting louder, more insistent. I think she's angry about something, but I can't remember what. There are so many things I can't remember anymore. And later, I've decided to join her. It's the only way to make the sound stop. The final entry was dated just 4 days before the missing person report was filed. But the handwriting was different, shakier, as if written by someone whose grip on both pen and reality had become uncertain. I understand now, there was never a sister, there was never an accident. There is only me and the sound I make when I try to leave. I closed the diary and sat in that too quiet living room, listening to the grandfather clock mark time with mechanical precision. The pendulum swung back and forth, hypnotic in its regularity. I found myself wondering how long it had been since anyone had wound it, how long it could continue marking time in an empty house. The thud came again, softer now, almost tentative. I approached the wall where the sound seemed to originate, pressing my ear against the faded wallpaper. The roses seemed to shift under my gaze, their petals rearranging into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Behind the wall, I could hear something that might have been breathing, or might have been the house itself expanding and contracting with changes in temperature. The sound was rhythmic, patient, as if whatever made it had been waiting a very long time to be heard. I called in the construction crew the next morning. They found the hidden space exactly where I expected it to be, a narrow gap between walls that had been sealed off decades earlier during a renovation. Inside was a chair, a small table, and evidence that someone had spent considerable time in that cramped, airless space. But no body, no physical evidence of what had happened to the missing woman, just the lingering sense that something had been resolved in a way that defied conventional understanding. The case was officially closed as a missing person with no leads. The house was eventually sold to new owners who mentioned, in passing, that they'd had the grandfather clock repaired. It had been keeping poor time, they said, sometimes stopping altogether for no apparent reason. I drive past that house sometimes, though I'm not sure why. The new owners have replaced the wallpaper, updated the lighting, made it into the kind of place where patterns are reliable and sounds have explicable sources. But I still find myself listening for that gentle thud, that patient tapping from behind walls that may or may not conceal the spaces where people go when they can no longer bear the weight of being found. The pendulum swings, time moves forward, and somewhere in the gap between what we know and what we fear to know, the sound continues, waiting for the next person who will press their ear against the wall and wonder what stories are told in the spaces we pretend don't exist. I understand now why some cases resist resolution. They're not meant to be solved in the traditional sense, but rather to be carried like a weight that shifts but never disappears. The truth isn't always something that can be uncovered and examined in daylight. Sometimes it lives in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the pause between one tick of the clock and the next. The sound follows me still, not literally, but in the way that certain frequencies become part of your internal landscape, playing just below the threshold of conscious awareness. I hear it in quiet moments, in the settling of my own house, in the spaces between words when people are deciding what they're willing to say aloud. And sometimes, when I'm very still and very quiet, I think I understand what it's trying to tell me. That disappearance isn't always about going somewhere else. Sometimes it's about finding the hidden spaces that were always there, waiting patiently behind the walls we build to keep the world at a manageable distance. The grandfather clock in that house is keeping perfect time now, its pendulum swinging with mechanical precision. But I know that precision is temporary, that eventually all clocks slow down, all patterns break, all walls reveal the spaces they were built to conceal. In the end, that's what haunts me most about the case. Not what I found, but what I didn't find. Not the sound itself, but the silence that came after, when I finally stopped listening for answers that were never meant to be heard.